Welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market. Hello and welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market. This is our 5th series for Radio 4, still the only comedy show to openly celebrate the glories of the free market. And I'm delighted to say that through a series of punitive tariffs, restrictive practices and outright physical threats, we've seen off all competition. In fact, following the cancellation of Whoops, There Goes My Pound, Laugh Along a Peston and Money Box Live at the Apollo, we once again have the field to ourselves. We are so grateful to our loyal audience who have stuck with us through thick and thin and enabled us to switch to a subscriber model very shortly. Early bird discounts available. So, this seems to be the right moment to seize the bull by the horns, the bear by the paws and the tiger by the tail and plunge a little deeper into some proper economic theory. I will as ever be joined by the very well established and respected Tim Harford, FT columnist and absurdly prolific author who is by now only too well aware of the nature of this show, but also resigned to the value of cross-platform marketing. Tim Harford, ladies and gentlemen.
Hello, Simon. How are you?
I'm very well, Tim. And you?
Oh, I'm doing splendidly. I am so excited that we're finally going to get to do a show about economic theory.
Proper economics. You've been teased on the previous 4 series, haven't you? And then it's been snatched away from you just as we were really getting onto some graphs.
Yeah, in fact, I'm so excited. I've arranged for the entire show to be redubbed with the Eye of the Tiger underneath it so that me and Mark Carney can work out before Davos.
I do want to see that montage scene. That sounds very exciting. Now, everything we've done so far on this show, as many of our audience here will remember, has been about specific market mechanisms. We have pumped the oil business dry. We've savoured the black, white and Kenyan blue of the coffee trade. We've excavated the mortal remains of the funeral game. And we've clicked on the likes and dislikes of the social media racket. All well and good. But we couldn't help noticing that while we've been occupied with such engaging trivia, the actual worldwide economic situation has been sort of on fire. And not in a good way. Not so much, whoa, you're on fire, as you're on fire. So what more vital time could there be to look at the history and ongoing validity of the great competing theories of macroeconomics? How does it all come together? And is there time to save the world? Tim?
Yes, Simon, we're going to spend 3 episodes looking at the last 3 centuries of economic thought as represented by what we believe to be their most iconic economists.
Iconic economists?
Iconic economists, a phrase previously only used to test denture glue.
So we have selected Adam Smith, Karl Marx and John Maynard Keynes. We will parade these 3 before you, once in a swimsuit and once in evening dress, and then try and trick them all into saying something that'll shock the tabloids.
And then in episode 4 we'll attempt a synthesis of all we've learned and try to figure out where to go from here.
So, as always, I'll be arguing for a return to feudalism. You can't argue with the aesthetics or the ecological credentials. Smith, Marx and Keynes, however, these figures are little short of messiahs to their proponents, and they dominate the intellectual landscape in a way that mere philosophers, let alone politicians, can only dream of. These are the big beards of economics, the bristling moustaches and the brightly buckled shoes. And their insights, calculations and hallucinations remain as contentious today as they were when they first were inked into place hundreds of years ago. Economists come and go, but few really make a difference, and few stay in fashion, Tim. I notice this. It seems to be a constant surging change. Does this suggest that economics is still some way from earning the respect due to a proper objective science?
Well, I don't know about economics. I certainly feel like I'm some way from earning the respect that I'm due. I mean, science, it's a funny word to use of economics, isn't it?
It's a social science, and in that sense, not one. Social is so often a positive, isn't it? And yet in this instance, no. So, let's start with the very genesis of economics, which does indeed, appropriately enough, begin with Adam. Adam Smith, bug-eyed father of modern economics and current face of the £20 note. It is Smith's bulbous profile which currently adorns the only proper banknote currently in regular use. Plastic, for Christ's sakes. That's what you get for pandering to the cocaine generation and people who can't be trusted to empty their pockets before they put their clothing through the wash. Anyway, before we proceed, let's see what our studio audience know about him. Before they came into the theatre, we asked them to write down 3 things that come to mind when they hear the name Adam Smith. Here's what they said. Grandson of the famous Apple magnate. He's talking about granny. Is magnate? That sounds a bit more domestic than that. Man with invisible hands. And then number 3 is left blank, possibly an illustration of the invisible hands. I'm not sure. Wealth of Nations, very good. Adam Smith Institute, brackets, mean right-wing bastards. And £20 note. And that it should have been a woman, possibly Granny Smith. I don't know. Adam who, Adam who, Adam who? Sounds a bit like Shawaddy Waddy or something like that. Scottish, Wealth of Nations, and economics.
That's not bad.
Not bad. Bit root one. Here's another one from someone who says they were looking at a statue of Adam Smith in Edinburgh last week. I know this statue very well. It's on the Royal Mile, placed very sweetly, almost opposite a statue of his old friend David Hume, whose toe is frequently rubbed by students for luck, which must infuriate Hume, who dedicated his entire life to trying to eliminate superstition from the world. But there we are. Street though, the Royal Mile, good to see, and it is at least a proper statue instead of some idiot pretending to be Yoda. Here's... Not bad. Let's see whether they can identify him from pictorial evidence, because this will make great radio. We have some pictures of 17th and 18th century gentlemen. We'd like to see whether Smith's profile, despite the fact that he is, as I say, on a popular banknote, whether he is a recognisable figure. Tim, hold up the first one. Who do we think? Is this Adam Smith? Is that Adam Smith, anyone? Anyone know who that is? Well, they do know. Educated audience. That is Benjamin Franklin. Very good. How about that one? Interesting. Nobody knows who that is. It's not Miles Jupp, but you started with the right... That is brilliant. I'm going to send that to Miles. That is Miles Jupp in another 10 or 15 years, definitely. That is actually Meyer Rothschild, the head of the great banking dynasty. And finally, there is Smith. His strangely carp-like features, looking as if he'd been bashed over the head in order to get him to sit still for 5 minutes and have his portrait taken. So, not bad, audience, not bad. I was braced for a less well-educated response than that, but nevertheless, I think it's fair to say his image is not the most famous in Britain. Tim, before we get into his economic theories, let's, as Melvin Bragg would say just before I doze off in another edition of In Our Bedtime, let's situate Smith in his timeline.
Yes, let's. Adam Smith was born in June of 1723 in Kirkcaldy, Fife. Many years later, a young Gordon Brown would grow up there.
Ah, well, we'll call it even then, Kirkcaldy. So... June 1723, just at the start of the Scottish Enlightenment, by which I don't mean the sense that June marks the brief enlightenment every year in Scotland, generally when the sun clears the Cairngorms at its zenith and the pale, confused natives stagger out into the streets, staring and pointing before blistering and scurrying back indoors. The Scottish Enlightenment referred to a period in the late 18th century, a sudden flowering of free intellectual inquiry. But this hasn't quite started just yet. What was Scotland like in 1723?
Smith emerged into a Scotland that was just coming to terms with its new status as a much-valued partner in the newly united kingdom. But muttered curses and bitter ballads of thwarted nationalist fury aside, the main theme of the 1700s was commerce and, gradually, industrialisation.
So, picture it. Glasgow's docks are thriving. Fortunes are being made. Top-hatted businessmen are vying with old-fashioned land-owning aristocrats for the upper hand in national policy.
Absolutely. A major plot driver of the 18th century. To be honest, a major plot driver of the modern Conservative Party.
Top hats, I think, should be worn in order to indicate your alignment within the Tory party. I do think hats would make an awful lot of difference. They could be thrown into the air in exuberance as well during Prime Minister's question time. I think we're really missing out from the lack of hats in the House of Commons. But there we are. That's a digression. The capitalists were in the ascendant. Smith himself was born into a civil servants family, although, like Harry Potter, his father was dead when he was born. Possibly wizard-based, possibly not. But anyway... As a consequence, Smith remained touchingly close to his mother for the rest of his life, never marrying or using his wily economic charms to seduce the various continental courtesans who history relates were genuinely beguiled by his strikingly carp-like features. Or possibly his invisible hand. conventional upbringing, Tim.
Yes, little indication in his early life that he was to change the course of Western civilization, but then I suppose very few future economic geniuses spend their childhood peering judiciously at the flow of capital through the tuck shop, or making time and motion studies in their journals while their friends are kicking a ball around.
I suspect you're in denial about this, Tim, aren't you?
I am.
It was a perfectly valid childhood. Don't you feel defensive about it?
Now, there was one thing that happened to Smith that was exciting, or at least this is what all his biographers say. They all say, at the age of 3 or 4, he was kidnapped by gypsies. And that, I don't know if that was a thing, but that's what they say. I don't know if he would have made a very good gypsy. He was a very absent-minded fellow.
Yes, I believe later in life he was so lost in thought he fell into a tanning pit while he was explaining the benefits of the division of labour in a leather factory and had to be scooped out by several workers from a potentially lethal cocktail of various chemicals in there. I don't think he'd have been as nimble on his toes or as alert as you need to be to flourish as a gypsy. I think economics game was lucky Heather's loss, but never mind.
I think for
politically correct audience are not comfortable on this territory at all. In the 18th century, it was perfectly okay to make jokes about gypsies, and that's when these jokes are taking place. Anyway, Tim, business is taking off nicely as Smith is growing up. In what sense can it be true to say that he invented economics? Surely it was already happening all around him.
Well, it was, but what Smith brought to trade and industry is, I think, analogous to what Darwin a century later brought to biology.
Monkeys.
No, more that he didn't invent it, but he identified the underlying mechanisms that allowed it to function, and thereby he flagged up what could be done to encourage it, or if you weren't careful, to stifle it.
Interesting. So, a brief recap of his early career. Smith is a smart young lad. He matriculated, or went, to Glasgow University at the age of 14. But that wasn't that unusual back then. Unburdened by the benefits of the modern comprehensive system, clever children could progress remarkably quickly. At Glasgow University, Smith befriended David Hume of statue fame, often described now as the greatest philosopher to write in English, or at least Scottish, which for the most part is near enough. Hume was controversial in his day, chiefly for his evident, if not quite explicit, atheism. Later, whilst at Oxford, simply to be caught reading him in the common room was enough to get Smith into trouble. "Who are you reading?" thundered his senior. "Hume," admitted Smith. "Very well then, whom are you reading?" And thus was born a sketch format which is revived regularly to this day in reviews from Kakari to Kathmandu. Smith was in Glasgow lecturing on moral philosophy when he received an alluring offer to accompany the son of the Duke of Buccleuch as a tutor on the European Grand Tour. This, which might have looked like a step back from the front line of serious study, was actually very likely the event which triggered the breakthrough for Smith.
Yes, he goes off, and unsurprisingly, he finds this young lad... he finds him rather tedious company, to be honest. It turns out teenagers could be poor conversationalists even in the days before Wi-Fi.
Yes, it's hard to imagine, isn't it? Going through rural France, every time you go into a cafe, it's like, "Have you got a pigeon?" It would just be annoying after a while.
Yes, Smith's diary records that he began writing a book to pass the time. We don't know for sure if it was what was to become The Wealth of Nations. We do know that having met Voltaire and Rousseau and various other celebrity intellectuals, this is France, remember, Smith was invited to the court of Louis XV, where he encountered Francois Quesnay and the Physiocrats.
Ah, yes, Francois Quesnay and the Physiocrats, one of the finest frat bands of the 18th century. They still tour under that name, but most of the original Physiocrats are dead now, sadly.
You may be getting confused, Simon. The Physiocrats were proto-economists, developing the idea of political economy as a human body.
Now, I like this idea because you've got to remember, at this time, there was no such thing as economics in Britain. The word economy existed, but it only meant what it means today when you see it in huge sans-serif type on the side of a box of own-brand washing powder. It basically means household management and saving money.
Quesnay wasn't an economist. He was Louis XV's physician, but he dedicated much of his life, with the king's indulgence, to developing a tableau économique. Quesnay believed that agriculture represented the only truly productive sector of society, and he was unable to see how manufacturing, let alone services, added more than specious rent-seeking claims to productivity.
The only true value comes from farming, a sentiment still popular today in parts of Norfolk, as it happens. So this seriously may have been the birth of modern economics, this meeting of two great minds. Was this the only dominant thinking about wealth in the UK at the time?
It wasn't. In fact, the dominant thinking in the UK was a mercantilism. This held that wealth was was simply gold. End of.
It does sound a bit Route 1, doesn't it? But it was slightly more evolved than that. Remember, international trade has only just come to be seen as a valid alternative to warfare, piracy and pillage as a way of interacting with your neighbours. Mercantilism mainly proposed that the health of the nation came from ensuring a balance of trade surplus and continuing to heap up the bullion as a result. So, who came up with mercantilism and why isn't he famous?
Well, there are several people, but the most prominent was a fellow called Thomas Munn.
Ah, yes, after whom money is named, of course. It isn't. No, sorry, that was a joke.
Yes, joke, very good. Munn wrote a book called England's Treasure by Foreign Trade, or The Balance of Our Foreign Trade is the Rule of Our Treasure. This was back in the days when the first few paragraphs of a book were generally included in the title to get you warmed up.
I like that. Nowadays, of course, the idea that you should pursue a balance of trade surplus above all other considerations sounds antiquated and primitive, and is practiced only in a few backward nations such as China and the United States of America. But this was the dogma of the time. So the big question is, if no one had ever called themselves an economist, how did anyone know who to avoid at parties?
I think avoiding people at parties in Georgian society was fraught with such issues, but it was deftly explored in the works of Jane Austen. Smith himself didn't think that he was an economist. He thought of himself as a moral philosopher. In fact, he even regarded his magnum opus, The Wealth of Nations, as a continuation of, in fact, almost a footnote to, his earlier work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments.
Now, this is seriously a much overlooked work, which I intend to showcase one day if they ever greenlight my Sunday evening programme, Simon Evans Goes to Church. Genuinely is, though. I recommend it. It's ahead of its time. It finds the root of moral behaviour in feedback loops of social interaction, the awareness we have of being observed and whether we're doing good or evil, and of watching others to see how our behaviour is received by them. It is, to quote and render briefly intelligible the immortal Rabbi Burns, to see ourselves as others see us.
Yes, there's a wonderful thought experiment about an earthquake in China. He says, imagine you heard that there was an earthquake in China, millions of people had died. You'd feel bad, you'd talk to your friends about how bad it was, and then you go to bed, you go to sleep. You wouldn't lose any sleep over it. On the other hand, let's say the doctor said that your little finger had become gangrenous, and he was going to have to amputate your little finger in the morning. You'd lose sleep over that. So that's what Smith meant by self-interest. We're thinking about our own concerns and we're obsessed with our own interests. But, and this is the interesting thing, he said, imagine that someone said, if you removed your own little finger, you could save the lives of all of those millions of Chinese people. He said, and I think he's right, most people would say, okay, that's fine. I will take that sacrifice. There are millions of lives at stake. So we're not selfish. We just think about ourselves more than we think about other people.
I think, to be honest, if I were able to sacrifice a little finger and save hundreds of thousands of lives in China, not only would I do so out of sort of, like a humanitarian gesture, but the anecdote potential in that, if people were asked, oh, this, yes, quite interesting, actually. Anyway, still on the theory of moral sentiments, this kind of investigation into the origins of morality was very much the study of Smith's friend Hume, of course, and the Enlightenment generally. After all, prior to this era, it had not been entirely necessary to understand the hidden mechanisms of human behaviour, or indeed trade and industry, because society was based on tradition, a tradition that it was widely believed God had laid out quite explicitly in the Bible. But with the increased circulation of the King James Bible and the opportunity for ordinary people to start picking holes in the text, gradually but inevitably came the Enlightenment. And it was in this context of Enlightenment that Smith published his follow-up to the theory of moral sentiments. In 1776, after a 10-year gestation, he publishes An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. It's an immediate hit. It sells out in a few months. I believe he said it inspired a change to the tax system.
It did, yeah. The Chancellor was paying attention, which is more than they do to economists these days, and the book was very much reviewed and quoted.
It's fantastic, and Smith has remained the poster boy for free market capitalists ever since, or would be if free market capitalists actually bought posters, which of course they don't, being able to afford to invest in proper art with a nice frame, and a vault to keep it in. Posters are for Marxists.
I'll speak for yourself. I love my Adam Smith poster at college, and I will say this for the man. He was able to maintain his dignity while crossing a tennis court with no knickers on.
So, The Wealth of Nations lights up. Has anyone read it? Anyone in this audience? Has anyone actually ever read The Wealth of Nations? A few people have. Marvellous. Excellent. What does it tell us? Anyone want to shout out?
Pinheadism.
Pinheadism, very good. It does begin with pins. Maybe we should go straight into that, Tim.
It is indeed on page 1. This very detailed and excitable description of the benefits of the division of labour, and it's as seen in the manufacture of pins. There's no abstraction. He's straight into the pin specifics.
The pin factory, he believes, that it was an extraordinary innovation because any one individual man would have to go through so many stages to make a pin. He'd be lucky to make a handful of a day. You've got the smelting, drawing the wire, snipping, sharpening, putting on the heads. I think there are 18 different stages he identified. Breaking this process down into different stages and then distributing them across the workforce, you can get literally thousands of pins to churn out of this factory.
The division of labour, it's this huge boost to productivity.
And also to voodoo, of course, in this particular. I mean, you could use all these extra pins to drive into a doll fashioned from Louis XVI hair and earwax and thus defeat France, which is no small matter at this point in history. But mostly productivity, yes.
Yeah, mostly productivity. I mean, it's the big idea here is the division of labour. And he thought the division of labour boosts productivity and it needed to be maximised at all costs, scaled up to be responsible for a nation's economic success.
But is this what Smith amounts to the wealth of nations then? Cheap and plentiful pins. That's the fundamentals of it.
And that is fundamentally it. Yes, it's about the pins. Because he's extrapolating this across all human activity and he's saying that productivity that's key. That's what creates wealth. And that might seem fairly obvious, but at the time it's a new idea. At the time, people are thinking gold is what wealth is. And Smith is saying, no, gold's just a store of value. This is why beggar thy neighbour doesn't work. The wealth of all nations lies in their ability to keep their populace actively and productively engaged in producing something that people actually want.
Where I want to know does the famous invisible hand come into? This is a famous concept which Smith introduced. What is it, wagging its invisible finger at the workforce, telling them to make more pins? What's it doing?
No, people are still arguing about exactly what Smith meant by the invisible hand. He used the phrase more than once. He used it in different contexts. It was actually floating around anyway. It's in Shakespeare, for example. So we don't know exactly what he meant, but whatever he meant, economists these days have something very specific in mind when they talk about the invisible hand. They mean the market allocating scarce resources to efficient uses, even though nobody's in charge. So, for instance, if people are willing to pay a lot of money for, say, sourdough, then suddenly bakeries are going to switch to producing it, and supermarkets are going to figure out a way to make cheap sourdough flavouring, and farmers will grow sourdough-friendly grains, and so on and so on. And if the price of sourdough rises too much, some people will find something cheaper to eat. And all of this happens without the need for some minister for sourdough.
Yes, who will nevertheless be appointed with great fanfare just as the craze for sourdough begins to abate and will then have to resign after some racist ciabatta tweets emerge.
Yes.
The point is he's very much in favour of letting enlightened self-interest set the market. This is the point, right?
Yeah, he is. And remember the example of the Chinese earthquake. So by self-interest, he doesn't mean ruthless, selfish amorality or immorality. He just means, we tend to think about ourselves a lot and we tend to think about our own interests quite a lot and we act accordingly. But, it doesn't mean that we're vicious bastards, because those interests include nurturing a good opinion of ourselves. We have to live with ourselves.
He's genuinely quite moral about this, and I think this is interesting because there are older people, including people who filled in our forms, who believe that Adam Smith and the Adam Smith Institute and things done in his name are essentially like Gordon Gekko in the Wall Street movie. Greed is good. Greed drives human ambition. Greed, by its very definition, is a sort of toxic overdose of this sort of self-interest which he's talking about. He wasn't keen on that at all.
He wasn't keen on that, and there was a previous writer, Bernard Mandeville, who wrote an essay called The Fable of the Bees, or a poem called The Fable of the Bees, which is all about comparing bees to humans. But it says that vice turns to virtue, and so greed drove economic activity, and everything worked out well. And it's hard to know how much he was joking, but Adam Smith, he hated it. He didn't want any part of that idea.
He had that level of self-restraint and only taking what you need, which is important to make any kind of system work.
Yeah, we're not constantly, it's not a society of thieves. And for a man who wrote an entire book about what induces people to behave in a moral way, it would be strange if he then had a view of the economy that involved just backstabbing and stealing at all possible opportunities.
Another key Smith theory from his masterwork that we can't leave without mentioning is, of course, free trade.
So So Smith asserts that free trade between nations is always to their mutual advantage and must be pursued as vigorously as possible without undue regard to the possible balance of trade deficit and the subsequent loss of bullion. Now, this was the most threatening of his insights to the received wisdom of the time, which was mercantilist. And the mercantilists were very keen on tariffs and that kind of thing.
And it is worth noticing that free trade was by no means taken up as universally as we like to imagine. The newly independent colonies of America, which declared their independence in the same year that Smith published, did not embrace free trade nearly as avidly as their own creation myths suggest. The evidence is that Smith was right, and all nations do flourish when this principle is observed.
Although it was actually David Ricardo who provided the coup de grace in this regard, with the principle of comparative advantage. He published that 4 decades after The Wealth of Nations. Simon, have we got time to do another half hour on Ricardo before the Archers?
I'm afraid I sense the studio audience becoming restive. Before we leave, Tim, could you perhaps reduce Smith's multi-volume work of ineffable genius to one final nugget of insight? For example, there will be people listening who may be thinking, fair enough, this Smith chap sounds very intelligent for his time, but this is 1776, the olden days. Today it's far more complex, surely, and human nature has moved on. What can this man from 250 years ago really have to tell us about modern human nature? And I think you found an example which demonstrates that he remains highly relevant today.
Yes, he has a lovely little riff, and he's talking about pocket watches, but I think he's really sending a message forward in time to the iPhone generation. He says, how many people ruin themselves by laying out money on trinkets of frivolous utility? What pleases these lovers of toys is not so much the utility as the aptness of the machines which are fitted to promote it. All their pockets are stuffed with little conveniences. They contrive new pockets, unknown in the clothes of other people, in order to carry a greater number.
Anyone who's ever put their phone on a belt, take note. So there we have it. Next week, ladies and gentlemen, we will be investigating Smith's nemesis, you might very reasonably argue, Karl Marx. In the meantime, my thanks to Tim Harford and to you for listening. Thank you very much, and goodbye. You've been listening to Simon Evans Goes to Market with me, Simon Evans, and Tim Harford. It was written by me, Simon Evans, with additional material by Tim Harford, Dan Evans, and Robert Ledger. Welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market. Hello and welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market, the free world's favourite comedy economics hybrid. This series we are looking at 3 big beast economists, their beliefs, their backgrounds, their context and milieu, from which we then hope to triangulate a path we might follow to save us from the present crisis, which seems to be brewing every time I turn on the bloody TV. I will be joined as ever by one of the country's top economic experts, much more affordable now after Michael Gove pointed out we'd had enough of them. Tim Harford, ladies and gentlemen.
Hello, Simon.
Hello, Tim. Now, Tim is here, of course, to keep me on the straight and narrow and alert me to any overreach I may be guilty of in pursuit of a satisfying, overarching narrative.
No, don't worry, Simon. I love a good oversimplification. I wouldn't be an economist if I didn't.
Excellent. So this week, let's crack straight on with him. Karl Marx. Before we start, as an economist, what do you think of him, Tim?
Right. So I should probably declare a bias. Marx didn't really like mainstream economists much, and, well, we don't really like him.
Well, don't worry. If the audience here wanted to hear pro-Marx sentiment, they'd be listening to the news quiz. In fact, we could probably power this episode with electricity generated as the last 3 comedy commissioners spin in their graves. Still, a good chunk of commie bashing in this show today should be sufficient to ensure BBC Radio gets another 6 months or so before enforced privatisation. But Marx is a big beast, isn't he? One of his most famous quotes is that philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways, but the point is to change it. And he did do that, surely.
Well, certainly indirectly he did that. Marxists did that. Although later in life, Marx himself apparently denied that he was a Marxist. It has been said of Marx that he was a man who identified deep problems and who proposed shallow solutions.
It does sound like Marxism was just a phase he went through at college. sounds familiar. He is a very controversial figure, but after having had what was widely regarded as a bad century, east of Berlin at any rate, Marxism has had something of a reputational revival recently, hasn't it?
Yeah, that silly idea about capitalism suffering worsening crises and eventually collapsing under the weight of its own internal contradictions suddenly started to seem a lot less silly after 2008 and the state bailouts of pretty much the entire financial sector. Given that since then no one in a suit and tie has been able to plausibly suggest what on earth should happen next, millennials in particular are wondering if perhaps it isn't worth reinvestigating Marx's prescriptions after all.
And not just millennials either. City brokers are now on record saying that Marx correctly identified the flaws in the system. Celebrity activists wearily tell Piers Morgan on television that they are literally communists, you idiot, and are not openly laughed at but are applauded for speaking truth to power.
And the Shadow Chancellor, lest we forget, makes no secret of his approval of Marxist analysis and openly flourishes Chairman Mao's reimagining of the same.
And stays in his job in a way that Theresa May probably would struggle to if caught with a copy of Mein Kampf on her Kindle.
I'm not sure you can get Mein Kampf on Kindle.
Yeah, you can, actually. Yeah, you can. It was for a thing. This Marx popularity revival is all rather reminiscent of the sort of brainstorming session that might take place at ITV2 when some tattooed Tristram with a man bun shouts, "Oh, I know, what about a reboot of the Generation Game?" Because he does not remember the unspeakable horrors of the Gulag or the eyeshadow of Isla St. Clair. So, let's find out what our studio audience think of him. They were asked while they were waiting in the queue, what three things come to mind when you hear the name Karl Marx? Here are a few suggestions. Lived in North London, had a big hipster beard, tried to open an artisan muesli shop but couldn't raise enough capital. I like that one. Harpo, Groucho, Zippo, very good, we'll be doing that one later. Fundamentally correct, pub crawl, boils. That's a nice escalation there from Rana Sham, thank you. What three things come to mind? Corbyn, okay, obviously. A small menagerie could live in his beard. A real cheapskate who didn't always give back his books to the library. Ooh. Plotted international revolution from the comfort of the richest nation on earth. No, I like the sound of Jessica Luscombe from Plymouth. She's got her head switched off.
I'm more worried about the not returning the library books, to be honest, than the revolution. That's
going to come back to haunt him, isn't it? Let's see if they can identify him. We've got three pictures here of bearded gentlemen. Let's see if the audience can identify Marx. Tim, would you show us the first one? Is that him? Darwin, very good, okay. How about that one? Yes, and finally... the great Ricky Tomlinson there, of course. Oh, I like to think allowed his spirit to inhabit him from time to time. So what comes to mind when you hear the name Karl Marx? He remains surprisingly popular in some respects, doesn't he, Tim?
He does, yeah. In 2005, there was a poll by Radio 4's In Our Time, which returned Karl Marx as Great Britain's favourite philosopher, with over a quarter of the total vote. Mind you, I don't know how much competition there is for that. Jeremy Corbyn was recently voted Britain's favourite opposition leader.
Phil, that is quite a turnaround for Marx. He's the man whose work John Maynard Keynes would describe as obsolete, scientifically erroneous, and without interest or application to the modern world.
So, Simon, are you a big fan of Marx?
You know what? I am torn. I am fond of private property and economic liberty, and frankly, I'm more of a two each according to his credit card type. I do like the idea of hunting in the morning, fishing in the afternoon and criticising in the evening, which Marx insisted everyone should be free to do instead of that division of labour specialisation racket. It's a strong demand and I like it.
Yeah, he did have that strength of character, didn't he? A lot of people feel he's like a roguish, venerated uncle who had a singularity of purpose that distinguished him from the mere time servers of political philosophy. He was a prophet, no less, whose critique of capitalism penetrates like no other. And let's not discuss the fact that he never really got off his arse, left the British Museum reading room and visited a single British factory.
Well, he had his mates to do that. Nor indeed that his views on the heritability of property softened somewhat, I believe, as he found himself subsisting on the inheritances of his aristocratic countess wife and his generous and indulgent factory owner friend, Fred. Nevertheless, Marx was a man of principles.
He was, and if those principles led to the deaths of untold millions, that's not something that should be held against Marx himself, or indeed anyone who wears a T-shirt with his name on it.
However, Tim, we must not spend our meagre half hour banging on about the regrettable consequences of Marx's insights. Instead, we must focus on deftly and entertainingly explaining what those insights were. It is challenging, but to make it fun, we've smuggled a handful of audacious Marx-based puns into the script to keep you on your toes. Listen out for the pun klaxon. So, Tim, can you briefly catch us up on where we are? What is the state of economic play that Marx inherits in the mid-19th century?
Well, the classical political economists, the centrist dads of their day, were riding high. Adam Smith laid the foundations. David Ricardo added a more analytical approach, along with the principle of comparative advantage, the completion of the argument in favour of free trade. John Stuart Mill argued in favour of liberty, and he insisted that while there were natural limits to production, the distribution of wealth was in our own gift. And of course we shouldn't forget the Reverend Thomas Malthus, who warned that giving the poor enough food only encouraged them to breed, and subsequently starve anyway. Quite the sermon.
All very clever, the thinky men, but they were in danger of being overtaken now by the relentless tide of industrialization. Big factories belching smoke, huge workforces working in hellish conditions for powerful capitalists also belching smoke, and indeed just plain belching. Steam had changed everything, from transport to manufacture to household appliances. People forget this, but before steam irons, they were all drawn by horses. Which was incredibly inefficient, not to say counterproductive if they got their hooves on your collars. Dirty.
The vast improvements were being made in the size and the efficiency of blast furnaces. And the addition of coke had a much more overwhelmingly positive effect on steel production than it later had on the advertising and music industries.
Bewildered by the pace of change, cheap labour was being sucked in from the countryside, set to work in the dark satanic mills of Bolton and Manchester, and then being made redundant by new technology and sent back home to the farm again by the weekend. And that's if you were lucky.
This was all new, and Marx wanted to deal with it. But first, he read all the classical economists with a mounting and barely suppressed fury. He had the intention of digesting them and then leaving the remains, in his words, on the dung heap of history. Now he was ready to theorise himself.
But before we jump into his theories, what of Marx, the man? As economists go, the general public know quite a few things about Karl. They recognise him immediately. In this theatre tonight, unlike Adam Smith, he is immediately recognisable, despite never having adorned the £20 note, and I think it's fair to say never likely to. At a stretch, Marx might find himself on the Cuban 100 peso. Stretch Marx, you missed that one, that's one. Back of the net. Marx's earlier life gave little indication of what was to come. For instance, as a child, he was apparently almost entirely unbearded. But let's dig into the background anyway to get a sense of the man and his music.
Very broadly, Marx spent the first third of his life in a fairly conventional pursuit of academic qualifications, first as a lawyer, and then, to his family's understandable disgust, as a philosopher, which wasn't the sort of thing they'd had in mind at all when denouncing their Jewish roots and converting to Lutheranism. Luther, by the way, was very popular in Prussia back then. It's taken us a long time to catch up.
Marx's PhD... Yeah, you got it, good. Marx's PhD was concerned with Epicurus and Democritus, ancient Greek philosophy. Modern Greek philosophy being then as now hardly worth bothering with. No offence, Yanis. His late 20s and early 30s were spent in a sort of 19th century extended gap year, drifting around Europe, making inappropriate acquaintances and pretending to understand Hegel. Often sullen and argumentative, he was already developing a reputation for being a bit of a grouch. Oh, Marx, his friends would say. Yes, you've got one. All right, that's 1-1.
Well done. Rather like the proto-soap dodger that he was, Marx, the activist, got unduly exercised defending the rights of some Prussian peasants to collect free firewood. You know, he never really calmed down again after that.
But the crucial year was his 26th, when he bumped into Friedrich Engels in Paris. They hit it off immediately, triggering the bromance that shook the world. Bit like us, eh, Tim?
I don't know about bromance. I think it's more of a brolaboration, Simon. Anyway, Engels was a fascinating character. He was a sort of mid-19th century Bruce Wayne, a wealthy industrialist by day, black-clad dispenser of economic justice by night.
Actually, Engels' Conditions of the Working Class in England is a magnificent work. It had already been well received generally, and it greatly impressed Marx, despite many of the working class in question working in Engels' own factory in Manchester. But what really impressed Marx was Engels' repeated ability to bail him out of financial difficulties over the next 40 years.
Nevertheless, we shouldn't be too facetious. Marx was a disaster when it came to personal finance. On more than one occasion, he couldn't go out in winter to the library because he'd sold his own coat.
Foreshadowing perhaps the planning acumen that would come to characterise those command economies later predicated on his theories. Probably only grew the beard because he pawned his scarf.
Nevertheless, Marx was committed to his work, and Engels was no mere deluded benefactor lavishing funds on a pet project. He understood the cause. He wrote beautifully. If he was alive today, he'd have a column in The Guardian called Engels Angles. And he was, by all accounts, a very clever individual, mastering 20 languages. Still, they were an odd couple. It's a bit like Frankie Boyle being secretly funded by Nigel Havers.
So, in 1848, the Marx and Engels partnership opened their account with the Communist Manifesto, a really rather poetic and thankfully brief screed by comparison with Das Kapital, at least. Lights up, brief show of hands. Who here has read the Communist Manifesto? Quite a few. I notice you don't have your hand in the air, Tim.
Oh, I hadn't realised you were talking to me, Simon. Of course I've read it. The manifesto was presented to the Second Congress of the Communist League in the Red Lion pub in Great Windmill Street, Soho, which is now a trendy cocktail bar. Although, maybe it's a trendy cocktail bar containing the seeds of its own destruction. Time will tell. Sadly, it's not a branch of revolution.
Some of you may be familiar with this, but this is how the manifesto opens to get you a sense of Marx's rhetorical style. In order to bring it some gravitas, we've asked Radio 4 newsreader Neil Sleet to have a bash at it.
A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this spectre. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. Where is the party in opposition that has not been decried as communistic by its opponents in power? Where is the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced opposition parties, as well as against its reactionary adversaries?
And I do hope that somebody tuning in randomly to the middle of this programme and hearing the Communist Manifesto being read out by a newsreader will have their most serious doubts finally confirmed. In 1848, this landed at just the right time. It was a promising-looking year for revolutionary movements across Europe, but it ended, sadly, with more humiliating climb-downs than an incontinent tennis umpire. Shortly afterwards, Marx was exiled from Europe for generally mucking about and decided to settle once and for all in the British capital, where, relying on Engels' Capital, he began to work on his masterpiece, which to capital he called Dosh and How to Get It. No, he called it Capital. Now, has anyone read Capital? Lights up. 3, and I don't sound that enthusiastic or willing to be probed. It's a book that took Marx nearly 20 years to curl out, and the first volume landed in 1867 to almost deafening silence. At this point, it's fair to say he'd had no serious impact on European politics, and no one wandering through Soho would have picked Marx out of 10 furiously bearded men criticising of an evening to be the one to turn the world on its head. Marks out of 10. I think a few of you got it with a muttered murmur, but that doesn't count. So, Das Kapital. Tim.
Right. I've just looked at the script. It says, Tim to insert summary of Marxism here. So, thanks for that, guys.
Come on, you must have.
Okay, right. 3 key ideas about Marxism. First, technology shapes society and the economy. The shift from agriculture to craft and then to the huge factories which his friend Engels saw all around him in Manchester massively transforms the productive power of the economy. It also gathers together a huge workforce in one place, oppressed, exploited, but also potentially able to organise and fight back. Second, the modern industrial economy screws the worker. The worker is more specialised. That's an insight from Adam Smith. And thus, unlike a farmhand, he or she can't just walk out and find a job somewhere else. Meanwhile, big capitalists swallow up smaller ones, so the factories and the firms get larger and more powerful.
You see, that does sound dated to me. That just couldn't happen in the modern world, could it? I'm sure the bosses of Amazon, Facebook and Google, for instance, would agree.
I'm sure they would. And third, the whole thing becomes unstable, and in the most advanced capitalist economies, there is a crisis from which communism naturally, inevitably, emerges.
Now, it is, I am assured, a very impressive critique of capitalism, but Marx is a bit vague on what the alternative is supposed to be, isn't he? It's all very, first the revolution, seize the state, then we'll figure it out. Yes, but seize the commanding heights. Only I was to seize the commanding heights.
Now, Marx didn't actually finish the work. He explains to Engels that he was going to write 6 volumes, one on capital, one on land, another on wage labour, and so on. And in the end, just the book on capital expands to 3 volumes, and 2 of those volumes aren't published in his lifetime. So at that rate, he was actually going for an 18-volume treatise on political economy. It was a man who thought big.
He may have found the solution by the end of that, I suppose, but I think it's also fair to say that Marx was awed by the productive power of the new factories.
He was. Perhaps ironically, he was incredibly impressed by capitalism. He thought, I think correctly, that it was the greatest wealth-creating machine the world had ever seen, and that it had finally torn down the centuries-old system of feudalism. It had freed up the capacity for human innovation and industry, as had nothing else before it. It was most unfortunate then, he explained, that because it relied on the exploitation of the proletariat to create surplus value, which could then be used to invest in technology that would lower the market value of that labour going forward, ever-worsening crises would eventually foment its violent overthrow and revolution. Shame.
Yes. Although, to be fair, Marx did correctly identify capitalism's tendency to lurch unsteadily from one crisis to the next. What he seems to be misunderestimating, to borrow a phrase, is capitalism's ability to flex and adapt to emerging, evolving challenges.
Well, so far, yes.
And I think it's fair to say that the defining characteristic of Marxism and its ultimate downfall is his conviction that he brought scientific rigour, scientific certainty to these calculations, that the whole of human history is susceptible to the predictive power that Newton brought to physics or that octopuses bring to the World Cup.
Yes, and it's all based on Marx's dialectical materialism, Marx's very own theory of everything. Every great Victorian had one.
It wasn't exactly his own theory, though, was it? He borrowed it, without permission, I might add, from George Hegel. But Marx gave it a spin. Now, Tim, you've bravely and successfully defined some very complex theories on this show over the years. Double Dutch tax sandwiches spring to mind. So, over to you to explain Marx's famous dialectical materialism.
Thank you, Simon. Marx adapted Hegelian dialectic to his own purposes, which were as follows. The world is not a steady state of affairs, it's in constant flux. And this is the manifestation not of ideas, but of huge, surging material forces, physical geography, available nutrition, complicated compound German nouns, that sort of thing. Nothing that anyone could consciously influence or defy or even get insurance cover for. So you have these great clashing forces, dialectical materialism, and foremost among them was class struggle.
And Marx said this has been going on since...
Well, since forever, basically. This is history. It's given rise to the French Revolution and to capitalism and to the institutions which the bourgeoisie had devised to protect their new privileges, and it would now give rise to the next revolution, whereupon, a new synthesis would see the proletariat seize control of the means of production. This would break the cycle. The class war would finally be won.
There'd be a blinding flash of light and everyone would look up to the sky and see some sort of vast, bearded figure smiling down at them from between the clouds and asking if he could borrow a couple of quid until his gyro came through.
Give or take, there'd be a brief transitional period known as the dictatorship of the proletariat, during which the right way of organising things would be quickly and efficiently discovered to everyone's satisfaction. And this is where Marx gets hazy. Then the state itself would be allowed to wither and die, leaving a self-sustaining harmony which would prevail among humanity thereafter, with little or no managerial oversight required. No more class war, no more dialectics, no more strife. It's all just going to happen simply and naturally. I mean, who would fall for such an idea these days?
But it is worth pointing out that Marx saw his job as not merely midwifery, but as applying the forceps to the emerging skull of the New World Order, if necessary, as those on the right side of history are liable to. This is a direct quote. "There is only one way," he said, "in which the murderous death agonies of the old society and the bloody birth throes of the new society can be shortened, simplified and concentrated. And that way is revolutionary terror." Which does put the Marx's ideas have been posthumously co-opted by violent extremists argument into perspective, I feel. And yet the irony, if irony isn't too cavalier a word when discussing a human harvest which enriches the topsoil of Kiev to this day, is that as a prophet at least, Marx got it completely wrong.
Yeah, Marx's argument was specifically about the crisis of capitalism. Capital always puts profit before proles.
Profiteroles.
Leading no, not to delicious pastries, but to the bloody overthrow and seizure of the state by said proles, QED. One only had to wait.
So where exactly did it all go wrong?
Well, it went wrong essentially in the emergence of the Bolsheviks. These were people who weren't in the mood to wait. In particular, there was a young man named Vladimir Lenin, who was inspired partly by Marx and partly by a Russian novel entitled What Is to Be Done, which suggested that Russia could bypass the boring capitalist stage entirely and go straight from peasant feudalism to nirvana.
Now, Lenin was essentially a spoilt middle-class brat and troublemaker whose mum at one point actually bought him a farm to try and discourage him from going to all these weird meetings. Sadly, that didn't work. Instead, he and a bunch of fellow miscreants essentially decided to get the ball rolling off the back of the Tsar's disastrous showing in the First World War. So he launched what was essentially a coup in one of the most backward nations on earth, and instead of displacing an exhausted capitalist hegemony like a cleansing fire, Marxism first emerged like typhus in a backward rural society, one in which millions of small farmers looked after humble plots on which they grew just enough surplus to keep themselves in shoes and vodka. And so millions died without ever knowing what it was like to be really truly exploited by capitalism at all. Still, does this mean then that when the likes of Aaron Bastani and Ash Sarkar tell you that actually real socialism has actually never really been tried, actually, there is some truth to that idea, Tim?
Well, there is. The other grand-scale attempt at communism was Mao's China, and in very similar circumstances. That is, a headlong rush at industrialization, a very similarly enormous death toll. Hardly ever have we seen anyone waiting for the conditions that Marx identified to arise. I would suggest never, in fact. Pol Pot, North Korea, Goldsmith College, they're all rural backward places. Which is why, grudgingly, I think I will agree that Marx's vision has never been tried.
Well, there's still time, Jeremy. Anyway...
We should remember, I think, in fairness to Marx, I'm not that sympathetic to him, but he was writing about the economy of the 1860s and the 1870s. And I think it's unfair if we don't acknowledge that, of course, some of what he writes isn't going to age well. It was a long time ago. I mean, for example, he wrote off the entire service sector. That's you and me, Simon. From the whore to the Pope, there was a mass of such scum, he wrote.
That's got the audience back on side, hasn't it?
Yeah, maybe that one's aged okay, I don't know. I think we've got to allow that just like capitalism, Marxism, Marxist thought, it can evolve, it can change after Marx himself had gone.
So as we draw to a close, Tim, do I sense you are softening a little towards Marx? Are you still the same economist of half an hour ago who said that Marx doesn't like us and we don't like him?
I'd say Marx has proved an extraordinarily resilient thinker, despite proving, alas, empirically unfit for purpose. I mean, to adapt the famous phrase of Churchill's, communism is the best form of government, except for all those times it's actually been tried. I mean, others will disagree, but as far as I'm concerned, a good summary of my position on Marx might come from a book that I read, a book I actually did read in preparation for this episode, and it's a Bluffer's Guide to Marx, basically. It's very sympathetic to Marx, and it ends in 1917, and it says, basically, Lenin proved Marx was right, the end. I'd be tempted to end in 1917 too if I was sympathetic to Marx. What about you, Simon? You a Marx convert after this half?
Well, in some respects, I have to admit, I do have a grudging respect. I have a fondness for Marx's prose. I think it's the grand rhetorical sweep of his vision, the Old Testament fire, because so much of economics is by comparison rather bloodless and apologetic and ambivalent. And also, because his grave, which takes the form of his head mounted atop a tall rectangular stone block, looks so exactly like an enormous Pez dispenser. It always cheers me up. Marx was himself laid there, of course, in 1883, his funeral in Highgate attracting just 11 mourners, though Engels predicted that his ideas would outlive him, and so it was to prove. Not least in Highgate, of course, which is still full of exactly the sort of people who speak enthusiastically about socialism while living quietly high on the hog of capitalism's abundant gifts and the singularly buoyant housing market which has prevailed in N5 these last 40 years or so. In other words, in the spirit of Marx to the very letter. At the time of Marx's death, almost no one had heard of him. Social Darwinist Herbert Spencer, originator of the phrase, the survival of the fittest, was the most famous philosopher in the English-speaking world. Today, Marx and Spencer find their roles reversed. That's the final one. That's all for this week, folks. Remember, no refunds. Next week, the most intelligent, urbane and literate man ever to waste an afternoon studying the coal and iron output of post-war Silesia, John Maynard Keynes. In the meantime, goodbye! You've been listening to Simon Evans Goes to Market with me, Simon Evans, and Tim Harford. It was written by me, Simon Evans, with additional material by Tim Harford, Dan Evans and Robert Ledger. Welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market. Hello and welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market. This is episode 3 in Iconic Economists, the tooth-loosening name we've given to our 4-part meta-analysis of the most significant economic figures of the last 3 centuries, from which we hope to synthesize a workable response to the very pressing need for it all to just stop. For the love of God, please stop. This week we are looking at John Maynard Keynes. Keynes stood head and curiously drooping shoulders above other 20th century economists. Both literally, at 6'6", he was a full 25% taller than his rival Milton Friedman. And figuratively, his career spanned the 2 world wars and hence unavoidably, as keen listeners will already have discerned, the Great Depression. And he left behind him a legacy that includes an Ian, Keynesian, which is a mindset governing principle that has been second only to Marxism in impact and by common consent rather more benevolent, a bit less Killingfieldsy, fewer skulls. In this episode we'll explore Keynes's life, loves, philosophy and ethics as much as his groundbreaking economic theories. Obviously for any half-an-hour programme that would be ambitious, let alone one which has squatted these last 4 years in what is actually meant to be a comedy slot and is going to be found out one of these days. Joining me as ever is award-winning undercover economist and FT columnist Tim Harford, ladies and gentlemen.
Hello, Simon.
So, John Maynard Keynes this week. Any preliminary observations before we get into the meat?
Well, he was a remarkable man in more ways than usual for an economist, and he was incredibly quotable. He was a statesman with the ear of heads of state on both sides of the Atlantic. He wasn't afraid to call a prime minister an idiot to his face. He made and lost more than one fortune, and he was very tall, really.
Very tall.
Very tall.
And lest we forget, of course, he was a magnificent shagger, wasn't he? And once again, to coin a euphemism, on both sides of the Atlantic. He managed to rack up a body count to make Tom Jones blush, Tim. He does make the rest of your profession look a bit staid.
He does. What are you saying about my body count? Anyway, he set the bar high. But there's actually a Canadian diplomat called Douglas LePan wrote about Keynes, and he said, I am spellbound. This is the most beautiful creature I have ever listened to. There is something mythic and fabulous about him. I mean, he just had a very strange effect on people. A very, very charismatic man, and yeah, very hard act to follow.
Before we proceed, let's see what our studio audience know about him. Before they came into the theatre, we asked them to write down 3 things that come to mind when they hear the name John Maynard Keynes. And the first one from Fong of Crystal Palace. Fong, are you still in the audience? You described him as old white man, so that's what we're up against tonight, Tim. Bob Butler of Chigwell says, threesomes, Virginia Woolf, Lytton Strachey. OK. Going down the other angle, wine gums from Peter. That's getting a laugh from the audience, so obviously means nothing, nothing to me. Economist and dead, which is fair enough.
Nailed it.
Strong, yeah, nailed it. Very well put. How supply is driven by demand. Bloody hell. Somebody else is going straight to the end of the show. What nice ties he wears, and his name is worth 56 points in Scrabble. I think they've guessed there. Well done. Excellent. So that's quite an encouraging spread of opinions. Now, before we get stuck into the economics of it all, what about Keynes the man? Like all good charismatic bisexual men. There are 2 ways to pronounce his surname. But he himself... Bowie. But he himself always said Keynes, perhaps so as not to be associated with Milton Keynes, which with uncanny precision he knew would be invented a mere 20 years after his death. He was good about the 20-year predictor. Milton Keynes is, in fact, of course, named after Milton Friedman and Kanye West, which was originally a services on the Keynes was not only the most influential economist of the 20th century, he was by a distance the most colourful. And I don't mean that merely as yet another polite euphemism for bisexual, although in that regard it is worth noticing that his experience in safely navigating the nexus of liaison that such proclivities generated in the Edwardian era may have helped him understand international relations that much better than the merely monogamous did. For instance, when he finally married at 42, his best man was his former lover, the painter Duncan Grant, who had had a child with Vanessa Bell, wife of Clive Bell, a child that another of Keynes and Grant's former lovers, novelist Bunny Garnett, gazed at in her crib and vowed to marry, as indeed when she grew up he did. This is the sort of detail which is hard to find when trying to enliven a biography of Mervyn King, say, or even Paul Mason. So, picking up where we left off last week, Keynes was actually born in 1883, the year of Karl Marx's death, wasn't he? Do you think his parents, Tim, were aware of this fact and had been waiting to make sure the world was safe for their child?
It's a tempting theory. Keynes's father, Neville, was an economist, but I think it's probable that Neville had never heard of Marx. Remember, Marx had no real impact in his lifetime. He was particularly not in English translation. He was a slow burner. At this time, the dominant thought in economics was neoclassical, and Alfred Marshall and his often ignored wife, Mary Paley, had written this amazing textbook building on the ideas of Adam Smith and David Ricardo. That was how people thought about economics at the time. Meanwhile, the economy itself was becoming more global and more prosperous. And actually, John Maynard Keynes would look back on this period in a later book as one which was all too easy to take for granted, this extraordinary economic stability which prevailed across Europe.
And you mentioned his father there. Keynes was the first son of Neville and Florence Keynes, in fact, an almost unspeakably respectable suburban couple living in Cambridge. How suburban were they? Well, Neville's father had made his money cultivating dahlias. That's pretty respectable, isn't it? And then when the dahlia bubble burst, and yes, there really was a dahlia bubble, that's penciled in to be covered in Simon Evans Goes to Market, series 117. He moved smoothly into roses, which if you've ever moved into roses is, you'll know, harder than it looks. So that was Keynes's grandfather. His father, Neville, was himself a Cambridge economist of some note who taught alongside Alfred Marshall, who you've just heard mentioned, who was probably the preeminent figure in the field.
But Neville Keynes was no fool. Actually, he published 2 books of his own, including one on political economy. And I like to imagine it's still occasionally purchased and perhaps even read, or at least begun, by people mistaking it for his son's work.
Yes, very good. I can't imagine what sort of idiot would do that when bulk buying Keynes books online to prepare for a hastily cobbled together radio biography. Neville swiftly became aware that his son John Maynard was a gifted boy, and this delighted him. He showed interest in interest from the age of 4, interest which only compounded by the age of 5 for reasons he was by then able to explain. And he was also capable of being rude in church within the hearing of the vicar, which is always a sign of a fast-developing native intelligence, I feel. Certainly stood him in good stead in later years at the Treasury. From January 1892, Keynes began to attend St Faith's preparatory school in Trumpington Road, Cambridge, which even by the standards of this cosy little story is surely made up, isn't it? St Faith's? Is that really a thing? St Faith's? They're not even trying, are they? Anyway, he then won a scholarship to Eton, of course, where he excelled, winning numerous prizes. I'm not sure what for, presumably not just pass the parcel. Though Marxist analysis would, of course, say that's exactly what they were for.
Yeah. The Marxist jokes aren't going down any better now.
Nobody gets it.
We're in the
Marxists would say that the Etons are just handing, passing it, then it doesn't matter.
We just have to explain it harder. So, look, after Eton, Keynes went to King's College, Cambridge, where he was recruited swiftly to membership of the well-known secret society. Actually, it says it in, Simon, in the script, it says well-known secret society. How can you have a well-known secret society? It doesn't make any sense. Anyway, the notorious and Not at all secret society, the Apostles. Well, the Apostles are pretty much what everybody imagines students at Cambridge must have been like in the early 1900s, only more so. They sat around eating anchovies on toast and they called them whales, which is annoying.
It's just annoying, isn't it? I remember we used to eat mackerels on toast sometimes and call it sardines, but that was just confusion, I think, affectation.
So the Apostles basically sat around, pretty much like you and your friends at Southampton, I imagine, Simon. They sat around debating moral questions, reading poetry. They included Bertrand Russell, E.M. Forster, most of what was to become the Bloomsbury set, with whom Keynes would hang out in all their pretentious bohemian fecklessness for the rest of his life. And their guiding principles were that life was about seeking truth and cultivating aesthetic appreciation. And above all, developing intimate and meaningful friendship with one's fellow man, which sounds unbearably pretentious and self-indulgent until you set it in contrast to the First World War, and then you see the appeal.
Yes, I think that's fair enough. Anyway, think of Uncle Monty in his youth before he realised he'd never play the Dane, and you won't be too wide of the mark.
Keynes continued to shine in all his endeavours, graduating with a first in mathematics, and he took the civil service entrance exam, coming second nationally, probably the last time in his life he came second to anybody, and his weakest mark was in economics. And he put that down to the fact that the examiner wasn't smart enough to understand the sophistication of his arguments. And I have to say, I have tried this argument. It doesn't... just didn't work for me. Anyway, he then went on and joined the India office.
Never actually went to India, of course, that being the sort of thing that could cloud one's judgment. To be honest, he barely even went to the office. Hours were apparently 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. in the civil service in those days, with an hour's break for lunch and 2 months' holiday a year. Still, as the saying goes, it didn't half cut into your day. Once in Westminster, he rose rapidly, another characteristic which had made him popular with the Apostles, and was soon communing directly with Prime Ministers Asquith and then Lloyd George. However, it was his contribution to the aftermath of the war, what was to be done and who was going to pick up the tab, which really brought him to international notice.
Because Keynes wasn't impressed with the drift of negotiations at Paris for the Versailles Treaty. As well as being privately engaged in a battle of walrus moustaches, Lloyd George and the French Prime Minister Clemenceau seemed to Keynes determined to renege on the principle of peace without victory. And they seemed to him to be driven instead by lust for vengeance.
It's an understandable reaction, but Keynes saw it was short-sighted. Germany and the Central Powers were being punished to satisfy the instincts of men who saw the future of Europe as an endless prize fight, he thought, in which the best you could hope for was that if you smacked Germany hard enough on the chops, it was a long time before it was able to get up and come at you again. Clemenceau, in particular, was adamant that Germany should be utterly humiliated, that it should do France's homework in perpetuity, should have a little poodle on its flag and be made to wear a maid's pinny and bonnet while it cleaned the Eiffel Tower with a feather duster.
Both Britain and France were determined to impose on Germany demands that would not only deliberately cripple her chances of recovery, but they would also cripple the chances of the civilization of Europe itself rising from the ashes.
And the poor Austrians fared no better. Keynes complained that they wanted to murder Vienna, though this may have been a mistranslation of an overheard remark to the effect by Clemenceau that he could murder a Viennetta.
Overall, Keynes showed a lot of chutzpah through all this. For example, he told Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, that his ideas were rubbish to his face when Keynes was just 30 years old. And remember, in economist years, that's only 12.
Very impressive, and having resigned his post in 1919, he published The Economic Consequences of the Peace. It's a marvellous work of literature. He spoke starkly of the inevitable results. If we aim deliberately at the impoverishment of Central Europe, he warned, vengeance, I dare predict, will not limp. He told the Allies that they were dooming Europe to further catastrophe. Specifically, he predicted a Second World War within 20 years, which would make it all 1939. Though, to be fair, he didn't mention Poland or a specific date, so it may have been a lucky guess. Nonetheless, quite a feat to predict a repeat of such rancour and hostility between those powers so many decades before the birth of Eurovision. So, the economic consequences of the peace made Keynes an international celebrity. This was in the days when grown-ups still read books, remember. Though, to be fair, this is perhaps the most elegantly written text in history with the word economic in its title. It's a narrow field. Most books of this nature should display an accompanying do not read while operating heavy machinery warning. Being capable of leaving your eyes as glazed as Fortnum's Christmas ham.
Simon, I can hear you, Simon. I mean, he points out that the government's economic decisions regarding Europe are going to prove disastrous, and yet he is ignored.
Would never happen today. But here's the thing. Although we have bigged this up and it's an enormous insight and it's a very serious work and very much worth your consideration, there are equally good arguments for saying that Keynes was not only wrong but actually politically obtuse, egotistical, maybe even opportunistic to publish at all, Tim.
God, that's a bit harsh, isn't it?
It is. But there is this alternative argument, I think, that in reality events did not pan out as he predicted at all.
Yeah, the logic is very strong, and yet if you actually look at the reparations that Germany paid, what the Allies were demanding might well have scuppered Germany's nascent recovery, but they didn't actually collect on those reparations because in an eerie echo of something or other, the whole thing kept being renegotiated. The terms of the peace were endlessly redrawn after 1919. They were given various new names. There was the Dawes Plan, the Young Plan, Soft Versailles.
Soft Versailles, you've made that one up.
Reparations Plus, V 2.0 Redux. Just concealing the capitulation. But one way or another, the Germans ended up paying not only significantly less than had originally been demanded, but significantly less even than Keynes had suggested.
That's interesting. You have to think, with so many endlessly rewritten peace plans, one wonders if the real victor of World War I wasn't actually W.H. Smith's.
Actually, most of Keynes's predictions for the peace were absurdly pessimistic, and that was a rare fault in Keynes. He fell into the classic trap of underestimating the Germans.
He thinks this German side are transitional. They need time to grow. They can't really be compared to the German squads that have dominated every single previous tournament. Oh, look, they've won again. So, Tim, we're up to the roaring 20s where Keynes roared along with the best of them. He's a famous author, a successful investor, amassed a fortune in the mornings, in bed in fact, in currency speculation and also in his pyjamas, and then spent his afternoons contributing prodigiously to the national and international economic conversation.
Yeah, and Keynes is fabulously quotable on the subject of the stock market and the currency market and so on. I mean, and he was unbelievably well connected. So this really happened. So phone goes on Keynes's desk. He picks up the phone. He's like, Maynard, Bank of England here. Just thought you'd like to know, interest rates going up tomorrow. There's a good chap. I mean, this is
quite handy inside information.
Yeah.
One of the things I love, I've read about his speculating on the stock market. He said that the thing about the stock market is you don't have to try and decide which stock you think is the most appealing. It's not really like a beauty contest. It's more like one of those photographic beauty contests they put in the newspapers where they show you all the lineup, or it can be most beautiful babies or best beauty, and then you have to say which one you thought won. So not which one you think you like best. So you're second guessing the judges. He says you have to try and anticipate not only which one you like best, or even which one you think the judges would like best, but which one you think everyone else will think all the judges like best. It's this like an endless reiteration of second guessing.
Yeah, and it's bizarre because all babies basically look the same apart from the hideous ones. So it's very strange. But yeah, I mean, he seemed to view the markets as a bit of a game. When he was actually writing to his father, trying to raise money for a currency fund, he said, win or lose, this high-stakes gambling amuses me. And I think the very fact, I don't know why you would say that to someone you were trying to get to send you money, but he was charismatic. He had this effect on people. But in the end, looking back from the end of his life, his record as an investor was absolutely fantastic. He outperformed the market by 6% a year over 25 years, which doesn't sound like much, but basically you're doing 4 times as well as the stock market as a whole. But he certainly had a few difficult episodes. So at one point, in the post-First World War years, he was running this currency fund, basically got completely wiped out, phoned up all the investors, said, sorry, I lost all the money, give me some more money and I'll make it all back again. And amazingly, he did. So he made a fortune, lost a fortune, made a fortune. Then for an encore, he started managing the funds of King's College, Cambridge. And that actually, throughout the 1920s, didn't go particularly well. And then after a decade of not going particularly well, you know what came next?
Absolutely. The Wall Street crash. Thank you. taking Keynes with it, and virtually every other know-it-all economist either side of the Atlantic. Fortunes, of course, were lost, but so in vastly greater numbers were livelihoods, the means even to survive. The Great Depression swept across America in particular, and Keynes dedicated the next decade of his life to unravelling the catastrophe and ensuring it never happened again. In 1936, he published his General Theory of Unemployment, Money and All That. Named without, that wasn't actually what it was called, I've adapted it slightly, but it was named the General Theory without a scintilla of modesty to attract deliberate comparison with Einstein's General Theory. The big question, Tim, every week we come to this, have you read it?
Have I read it? So it by it you mean...
The entire book, from beginning to end.
I've read, a chapter or two. I've read a chapter or two.
What is in it, though, in your own words?
In my own words. So Keynes was important for all sorts of reasons, but I think probably the biggest insight was the idea that markets weren't self-correcting. Maybe not ever, certainly not quickly enough for him. It's a very important idea because the mainstream view at the time was economies would boom and they would bust, and the process of recovering from a recession was basically a natural thing, and the economy would just re-equilibrate, and there was really nothing governments could do. And Keynes said, no, governments can intervene and should intervene to correct these failures, not in any particular market, but in the market as a whole.
So this was essentially, in short, the introduction of the word they into macroeconomics. As in,
yes, actually,
they ought to do something.
Yeah, well, and actually he also, I think, introduced the word macroeconomics. But, I mean, his views, if I describe it in a nutshell, in a recession, you should have a central bank, and the central bank should cut interest rates to stimulate demand. And if that doesn't work, the government should borrow money and spend. Either cut taxes or better, invest in public works, or just spend money on something. And when you describe it like that, I mean, that is an incredibly mainstream view. It sounds almost banal, but it was radical at the time. And he won the theoretical argument, or at least the general argument about that the government should stimulate demand.
Yes.
There are a couple of problems, though. So the first problem is Keynesian spending works in practice. Turns out it's really hard to make it work in theory. And, well, you laugh, but, we economists, we like our pencils lined up straight, OK? So this has been bothering us for a while. There's been a lot of effort to figure out what's actually going on and why it works. The second thing is Keynesian spending doesn't really accord with common sense. He's saying, if you've got less money, spend more money. Which works for an economy, but it just sounds completely baffling. And so a lot of democratically elected governments who have to justify themselves to the voters ignore Keynes's advice. The third problem is you can overdo it. You can overdo your ability to fine-tune the economy. And after Keynes's death, this idea caught on that economists should just be sitting there and just constantly nudging the levers backwards and forwards and fine-tuning every fluctuation. Basically, an end to boom and bust. And you know how that all ended up.
Opinion remains divided as to whether these measures or Roosevelt's quasi-Keynesian New Deal really helped end the Great Depression, or whether credit for that should really go, ironically, to the start of that Second World War that Keynes had been only too keen to avoid a few years earlier. But Keynesian theory almost certainly underpinned the 25 years or so which followed, and which is often referred to as the golden age of capitalism, a glory which tragically flowered on Keynes's grave. That was his legacy then, Tim, I guess.
Well, yeah, his final years were spent desperately and not entirely successfully trying to shape the new world order, which he could see was going to emerge after the Second World War. And he was trying, as far as possible, to remove it from American financial dominance and to salvage some workable post-Lend-Lease loan arrangement between Britain and the United States. And he was working, he was suffering heart trouble. He'd been told to retire on health grounds in 1937. And then, round about 1939, things started to get a bit tasty and he started working again. So, it's an extraordinary time.
This culminated with Bretton Woods,
yeah.
Relatively famous as economic summits go. 1944, the war is still on, but the Allies are starting to discuss what's going to happen afterwards now.
Which is a real display for Hitler and Japan. Like, we're so confident we're going to win, we're already planning what we're going to do afterwards.
So they hold this summit in a very high-end ski resort. This is one of its most influential, in fact, the idea of using ski resorts as economic summits.
Yeah. And it's at the Bretton Woods Hotel, which is, I think, in New Hampshire, and the great and the good, all the power brokers of the economic and financial system all get together in July 1944 for 3 weeks, and they're in all of these rooms of this hotel. By day, they are desperately trying to hammer out agreements as to how the world financial system is going to look, and by night, they are getting preposterously drunk. I mean, just an extraordinary amount of alcohol being drunk, although Keynes wasn't partaking because his wife knew he had this bad heart and she was desperately trying to get him to not to work too hard, not to drink too much. And this, Bretton Woods shaped the post-war order, so the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, all created at Bretton Woods.
And widely understood that Keynes was the dominant intellect, that he was applauded every time he sat down, that there were standing ovations and so on when he entered the room for supper. But ultimately the American financial heft carried the day.
Yeah, he was intellectually the star of the time. He was the most famous economist in the world. And it's quite a touching moment at the end of the conference where he gives this eloquent closing speech and everybody is there in their black tie, standing as he walks into the room to applaud the great man. But yeah, he probably lost most of the arguments with Harry Dexter White, the American. And he lost them because, the Keynes had the brains.
Yes.
The Americans had the money.
They had the cash.
But yeah, he lost.
There it goes. So post-Bretton Woods, having secured the best deal anyone could have in the circumstances, I think it's fair to say, and let's not forget, these weren't the days of self-certification mortgages and easy credit like the early noughties. All it took to secure finance then was to make sure, next to the question purpose of loan, you didn't actually write heroin. Keynes headed home with his cash. He did his best. When Keynes died, a colleague wrote to his wife that he had given his life for his country as surely as if he had fallen on the field of battle, which I think is a very moving tribute to an economist. The golden age of capitalism was Keynes's legacy, but perhaps his most poignant hope for the future was delivered in his Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, which was a very accurate forecast of economic growth in the long term and a terribly sad forecast that it would enable us to all be working 15-hour weeks, Tim. What went wrong?
Yeah. It was a great forecast of how rich we would be relative to the 1930s, terrible forecast of how hard we were going to be working. I mean, he wasn't completely wrong. So we do work less hard than we did in the 1930s, and he was completely on track until about 1970. And then in 1970, something went wrong. I mean, I don't know, disco or something. Basically, our hours flatlined, so they didn't keep falling. And it's not clear why Keynes was wrong about this. Maybe he didn't realise how much fun people had in their jobs. A lot of people enjoy their jobs.
I think people underestimate this the whole time. It's like home working, going home, not going into the office. You've got broadband, you don't need... People go insane. They don't realise you desperately need to waste time at the photocopier.
So...
Keynes does seem to have been a bit of a one-off, but of a type we could sorely do with today. And despite outmoded notions of morality, which continue to cloud our thoughts, much as he himself warned us they could, the fact is, our capacity to clone Keynes only improves with time. With the will and the funding, we could have an entire civil service staffed by Keyneses within 20 years.
I'm not sure about this, Simon. I feel if you got two clones of John Maynard Keynes in a room together, they would find each other irresistible.
Now, that's possibly true. Still, I think there's a delicious irony. Keynes's most famous observation was that in the long run we're all dead, but perhaps in the very long run Keynes might not have to be dead after all. I do think that cloning is a very Keynesian approach to a drought of naturally occurring economic genius, and I think he'd enjoy the irony, not to say the recent liberalisation of the law. In fact, I quite like the idea of an economic Jurassic Park all round. What do you think?
Yeah, herds of Smiths grazing placidly down at the waterhole, solitary Karl Marx rampaging behind the barbed wire enclosure.
Absolutely. A giant Milton Friedman, nearly 6 feet tall.
That's not how cloning works.
Well, pedantry. Thank you, anyway, ladies and gentlemen, for listening. Next week, for the final episode in this series, we attempt synthesis. What can we learn from Smith, Marx and Keynes to help us solve the emerging economic crises of the 21st century? Wish us luck. Goodbye. You've been listening to Simon Evans Goes to Market with me, Simon Evans, and Tim Harford. It was written by me, Simon Evans, with additional material by Tim Harford, Dan Evans and Robert Ledger. The producer was Richard Morris. Welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market. Hello and welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market. In this series so far we have examined the life and works of Adam Smith, Karl Marx and John Maynard Keynes. And in this, our final programme, I thought it would be worth seeing whether I could channel their wisdom to solve the world's current economic problems in just 28 minutes, not including jokes. This attempt, while potentially foolhardy, will at least have some structure. The plan is to outline 3 economic challenges for the 21st century: globalisation, automation and ecological collapse, and see how our 3 eco-profits might help us tackle them. As ever, I will be joined by FT columnist and undercover economist Tim Harford, who will advise me on the best approach, teaming these fine wines of economic theory with the meat, poultry and fish of economic reality. On this occasion, more discerning listeners will notice that Tim is locked in a small room rather than being with me here in the studio. This, I should point out, is not due to EU demands as part of the extension agreement that the country's finest economic minds are held hostage until a Brexit deal can be reached. It's simply a change of scene for us, and if the most famous undercover economist can't hide out occasionally, then frankly, who can? We popped him in a cupboard in the Ecuadorian embassy that had recently come. Before we introduce our first challenge, let's attempt an overview of our current predicament. What is the nature of the crisis that needs solving? Well, partly it seems to me that since 2008 we have been somewhat lacking a cohesive plan. If the global economy was a hippopotamus, 2008 was the year the cork finally flew out of its bottom, and we've been struggling since to stick it back in. When Lehman Brothers suddenly stopped in mid-air and then plummeted to earth like a flying gold brick having a heart attack, it triggered what was generally referred to as a worldwide financial meltdown. The last one of those was the Wall Street crash, of course, in 1929, which triggered the Great Depression and arguably the Second World War, which began exactly 10 years later. 11 years have now elapsed since our crash, and with no more than a 50-50 chance of war breaking out among the great European powers in the next 12 months, perhaps we're to be congratulated. Yet I can't help feeling that we still lack what might be called a plan, an overarching philosophy, dare I say it, economic Weltanschauung, on which to pin our hopes, however deluded. This would be fine if things were improving, but they clearly aren't. Wages are static, gilets are increasingly jaune, and the vibe less and less mellow all round. So I've chosen 3 economic challenges to what passes for the neoliberal consensus: globalisation, automation and ecological collapse, and we're now going to take each one in turn and see how they would have looked to Smith, Marx and Keynes. First up, globalisation. Now, globalisation means a lot of things to different people. For several years, for instance, I assumed it was simply a polite way of referring to childhood obesity. Broadly, it means more and more ever freely flowing goods, services, capital and labour across borders, and more recently the alarming ability of our planetary cohabitants to compete on quality as well as on cost. Now, globalisation is not a new phenomenon. In fact, it was getting underway very nicely in the Edwardian era, then suddenly stopped in August 1914. Historians are still at a loss to explain what went wrong. One of our featured economists, J.M. Keynes, wrote plaintively about the loss of a gentleman's ability to order up various delicacies from around the world and have them delivered to his door, all while lounging around in his dressing gown. And while the delivery might have taken a little longer than it does today, when Keynes's package arrived, he would have been asked to sign for it on an actual piece of fine watermarked vellum with a fountain pen, rather than prod his finger helplessly against a squishy LCD screen in a humiliating attempt to replicate his own signature with a single extended digit like an educationally challenged chimp unable to comprehend his own reflection. I spoke to Tim Harford about the challenges of globalisation and exactly how much we should be concerned about it. The first category of challenge that we confront, that we've identified, is globalisation, although I suppose even to define that is quite difficult. But
yeah, it could mean all kinds of things. It's often taken to mean trading products, but it could mean immigration and emigration. It could mean financial flows across borders. And I think for a lot of people it just means a sense of of powerlessness, a sense that they don't have control of their lives because nobody's in charge. And the whole idea that there's no world government, our government is, as we've seen, thanks to certain processes, it seems rather helpless in the grip of world forces. So people find this threatening, and they think, oh, there are people in China, there are people in Pakistan who are working under totally different conditions, totally different wages, competing with me. So, yeah, people find that threatening. But the opportunity is something, well, Adam Smith would have been first in the queue to outline. The wonderful thing about globalization is that you get to trade with anyone in the world. You get to take advantage of different skills, different capabilities, and enjoy a greater variety of products and cheaper products too.
I mean, I suppose the one thing you didn't say, that you get to exploit different degrees of expectation, of pay grade, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but it's not just about expectation, it's the opportunity, right? Joan Robinson, who's a wonderful economist who was a disciple of John Maynard Keynes, said the only thing worse than being exploited by capitalists is not being exploited by capitalists. So yeah, I mean, globalization is an opportunity for people in very poor countries, as well as an opportunity for rich world consumers.
It seems that you can't mention globalization without mentioning Brexit. Brexit could be seen as an anti-globalist spasm, though it is unlikely to stop it. Whatever version of it we are currently looking at by the time this programme is broadcast, al dente perhaps, it seems unlikely that the government will embrace the only version that is actually likely to stem the tide, neither hard nor soft, but total, complete and utter Brexit. Not merely restricting freedom of movement, but severing all links, physical, electronic, hypothetical and fictional, and not just with the EU, but with everything outside our own territorial waters. If we were to, say, erect a vast cloud bank around the British Isles and demand that all foreign maps replace any representation of our landmass with the legend, "Here be dragons," then we might have a chance of rowing back on the tide. In a few years' time, as far as the rest of the world were concerned, Britain would become a myth. I think deep in our hearts we all know that our greatest years were back when Britain was a myth, or ideally several competing myths, all with their own swords and citadels and knitting patterns, shrouded in mist and governed by magical ritual. And personally, I'm bang up for this. Put the House of Windsor back in charge. The Queen has been the only authority figure in my lifetime never to let me down. Her and David Attenborough, maybe. And I'm happy to pledge my allegiance, though I think we have to acknowledge that both she and Philip have probably run their course now. And the sad truth is that Charles has withered on the vine. I would probably skip William, too. He's a bit too agreeable for me, if I'm honest. I like the look of Harry to take up the throne. A bit of fresh blood, if you know what I mean. And you might be thinking, Simon, he's a nice lad, Harry, but he's not the sharpest tool in the shed. Well, maybe not, but he's got 2 A-levels and they're better than Jeremy Corbyn's, I can tell you. Harry on the throne and then prepare for a complete reboot. It worked for Bond, it worked for Batman, it can work for Britain. 20 years reconnecting to our mythical past, exposing our young to the toughening, hardening, vulcanising processes of cold winters. No Russian gas, no French electricity, no central heating in the winter, no foreign holidays. 2 weeks on the mud flats of the Severn Estuary just outside Weston-super-Mare. You're glad to get back to work. It builds character. I think we might start to wake up again. And then one day, when we're ready, we lift the cloud banks without warning and we set sail for Normandy. I reckon we'll walk right in. I'm telling you, House of Windsor, folks, it's German engineering with British trim. You can't beat that combination. Now, what are the next challenge we've identified? Automation. I spoke to Tim Harford about the challenges automation presents to us and which of our 3 featured economists would have most to say on the subject. So, Tim, automation, again, not a new challenge, something that we've been confronting for at least since the Industrial Revolution, but it seems to be going up a gear at the moment.
That's what people think. I mean, it's worth pointing out that automation is not as different from globalization as you might at first think. So, fun little economist thought experiment. Imagine some Silicon Valley type says that she has created this amazing factory on the coast of California with hyper-intelligent robots, and all you need to do is show up with sackloads of grain from, I don't know, from Iowa maybe, take the grain into this factory and the bio-robots will turn them into Toyotas and Hyundais. And out come these cars. Amazing. You know, this super technological automated factory turns corn into cars. And then one night investigative journalists break in and they realise, There are no bio-robots, they're just ships, and they're shipping the corn away, they're taking it to China, to Japan, to Korea, and the ships are coming back with cars on them. And you think you've been tricked, and then you think, well, actually, what difference does that really make? It makes you realise that trade itself is a kind of technology. It works on the economy in a similar way, and it can disrupt people's lives in the same way too.
So in that analogy, the cheap foreign labour essentially is like the robot.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but the challenge with automation, I suppose, is that if it is all taking place in the same country that you're in, I mean, this is, I think, where Marx comes in, isn't it? You're denying the opportunity of workers to earn the money that they need in order to buy the goods that you're producing. So you're cutting off part of the circular supply.
Yeah. So, I mean, the Marxist view, I think, of this is that automation is this incredibly powerful force, but in the end, if you get rid of all your workers, there's no one left to exploit, and therefore there can be no profits.
Although I suppose somebody has to make the machines. But we've already got to the point where machines can make the machines.
Yeah.
And at some point you get to the point where the machines make the machines that make the machines. And eventually, you eliminate the workers. It comes to a dry stop. But
it's basically just one lady with a spanner, and she is underpinning the entire global economy. So there's always been this threat, but in the past, we've always adjusted. The economy has always generated more jobs. We just got richer. Nobody regrets the fact that we lost all those typists, we've lost all those agricultural labourers. It's fine. We move on. There is this question as to whether this time is different, because the robots might finally replace the people who suck their thumbs and think about, and write about robots, like journalists and academics.
Yeah. It's a classist anxiety in that sense, isn't it? It's the middle classes are now under threat, from robots.
Yeah, robots are writing articles in business newspapers, for example. Suddenly, the moment this happens, business journalists are suddenly worried about the robot takeover in a way that they never were before.
It seems to me that automation is even more sinister these days now that it includes AI, artificial intelligence. I did a charity gig recently where the money was being raised for prostate cancer. Fine, I thought. But then I saw the film. Turns out the specific aim was to equip hospitals with mechanical arms that can investigate your symptoms without a doctor even being present. He can operate it remotely. They are essentially saving money so that surgeons can spend less time in traffic. But it will not be very long before they realise they don't really need him at all. If AI can steer a car safely through rush hour traffic, it can definitely steer an artificial finger up your jacksie. It has already been proven that machines give better diagnoses from reading data on x-rays than surgeons do, and prostate surgery is not rocket science, even if the aesthetics are superficially similar. What's more, studies have shown that people report a better all-round experience if the machine is left in for 20 minutes after it has last moved about. Strange, I know, but true, and it feels less invasive somehow. Machines can do that and not charge extra. You may wonder why I'm so obsessed with saving the careers of proctologists, but I see them as canaries in the coal mine, even though that is a slightly unfortunate analogy. You have to admit, after 8 years of medical training, being willing to do such an unglamorous specialisation would, you think, guarantee at least job security? But no, apparently not. Anyway, bit of material I wanted to shoehorn in there, if you'll forgive the expression. We move on now to the final of the 3 21st century economic challenges we've identified: ecological catastrophe. The end of the world as we know it. Some would say it isn't really an economic issue, it's a science issue or a religious issue, or possibly a mass psychological delusion. Actually, I guess religion covers that. But economics is defined as the study of competing uses for scarce resources, and nothing would appear to be scarcer right now than time. I asked Tim Harford about the threat of ecological collapse, a tricky one for Smith, Marx and Keynes, given that they all died long before the idea of the Earth actually trying to shake us off had become plausible.
So perhaps, Tim, the biggest threat that we confront as a species now is ecological catastrophe. It's controversial, but some people feel that this is an existential threat that we are not confronting realistically at the moment, and as much as anything else, it's an economic problem.
It's an economic problem because climate change, which is the most prominent ecological problem, climate change is caused by the release of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is generally released when you burn fossil fuels. There's also farming. Fossil fuels are fundamental to the modern economy. It's basically the whole kind of edifice of how we live, the goods, the services that we consume is polluting the atmosphere, warming the planet, and could be storing up an enormous amount of trouble for the not too distant future.
And so the normal incentives that correct bad behaviour, and that that somebody like Smith has established, that there is usually incentive that will draw out the correct responses from people if they're left to their own devices, just doesn't work in this instance.
No, and the person who I think would have pinned this down, although this is all pre-climate change, is Arthur Pigou. And Arthur Pigou was a contemporary of Keynes at Cambridge. And Pigou pointed out that if you're, say, polluting the atmosphere, you're not paying a price for that. And it's not reflected in any of the market transactions. So Pigou's solution, which is something that economists still advocate, would have been a tax. So a tax on any kind of pollution. In the modern world, it would be a tax on carbon and on methane and on other greenhouse gases. I think the interesting thing from the point of view of a mainstream economist, which is what I am, is that mainstream economics, I think, had an answer to this problem before we even realised there was a problem. Pigou was writing in the 1920s. Economists have been calling for Pigouvian taxes, for carbon taxes, since the 1970s, and we basically still haven't got it. And a lot of people say, well, economics hasn't given us the answers. I think in this particular case, it gave us the answers, and politics just couldn't deliver the recommendation of economics.
So there we have a story of our time. Economists blaming politicians for not listening to them. It's Michael Gove and his experts all over again. But one practical example of where one of our featured economic heroes of this series is helping to tackle an economic challenge today is seen in the Green New Deal, where Keynesian spending is suggested as a way to help us avoid eco-collapse. I asked Anne Pettifor, economist and proponent of the Green New Deal, to tell us more.
If we were going to war tomorrow, if this was Hitler on the doorstep, we would make a plan, right? Yeah. And our monetary system, and this is the joy of what Keynes argues about it enables us to do what we can do. Now, we may not have the military kit, we may not have the expertise, we may not have the aeroplanes we need, but the monetary system enables us to do what we can do. So if I were the governor, I would say, yes, the monetary system and the issuing of bonds by the government is the first step, because the government's going to have to spend, because we can't trust the private sector to tackle this climate crisis or tackle a war, because it's beyond the private sector. That's not to say we won't engage the private sector, but just simply that in this case the government is the roaring lion and the private sector is the timid mouse. So the government issues bonds, the Bank of England helps to finance those bonds by whatever means, by very transparent means. But then we look at the world's savings and we see, for example, that the world's asset management funds are managing something like $62 trillion. The numbers vary, but the OECD says they have $62 trillion in assets. Now, that's a fair amount of money. And now the question is, what should those funds do with that cash, right? And the problem at the moment is that they don't have safe places to invest that cash, which will enable that cash to have value in 30 years' time when they have to pay out pensions. And government bonds are the ideal place for a pension fund to put its cash. Right now, thanks to austerity, there's a shortage of government bonds. So we know that the private sector, which already has accumulated enormous sums in savings, needs to be able to invest in safe assets, they're called, which will earn them interest over time, because cash doesn't do that. Right. So we could look at the government issuing its own bonds, and then we could mobilize some of those resources, the $62 trillion held by pension funds and insurance asset management funds. And then we could look at mobilizing domestic resources as well and see whether or not people locally would want to put money into bonds in the way we had war bonds and that sort of thing. Yeah. So there's several approaches to raising the finance for this investment, and I honestly don't think it's complicated. I think it's entirely doable.
So there we have it, an apparently simple idea which begins with equating ecological collapse with a Third World War and thus jolting us into action. I worry that without the propaganda posters of the sea levels represented as a helmeted gorilla stealing our women, how are we going to mobilise? We urgently need more climate movies starring Gregory Peck and Gary Cooper lookalikes, and less blue hairs and neckbeards clinging to the underside of oil rigs. You know, the more I get into this, the more I think that my promise to solve the world's economic problems in half an hour might have been quite correctly considered overreach. As time is running out, not just for the planet, but for this programme, let's just change tack and try to at least end on some kind of emotional high note as we turn selfish for a moment and ask, what's in it for us? We've spent a whole series talking about the economic theories of Smith, Marx and Keynes. But can we make some money for ourselves by following their wise words to make profitable investments? In order to find out, I called FT and Money Week investment guru and friend of the show, Merryn Somerset Webb, at her home in Edinburgh, where I imagine she lives in tribute to the free market's favourite son, Adam Smith. I started by asking her whether a government following Adam Smith's theories is the most friendly to investors.
To the extent that any country really allows Smith to be their presiding eminence in their economic policy, I would imagine that's like an investor's dream, is it?
Well, it depends on your timescale, to be honest. I mean, it's an investor's dream if you're looking to the very long term. You're wanting to have a really vibrant economy with intense competition. And you and I both know Adam Smith was very keen on open economies, flexible economies, on full competition. He was very against the way that people gather to create oligopolies and monopolies and so affect productivity. So, you know, if what you're looking for is to invest for the long term in an economy where you will see a constant turnover of innovative companies, absolutely Adam Smith's your man. But if you're the kind of investor who just wants to buy 20 companies, leave them for 20 years and meander off, that's not going to be what you want to do. If you're a passive investor, you're buying the entire index, you're buying into the future of economy as a whole, that might work. But if what you're trying to do is buy selected companies, sit around and wait for them to become huge, maybe not. In fact, you might be better off investing in an economy that has a very Keynesian government interventionist approach, because then you might see the kind of regulation and what investors love. A word investors love is moats. It's Warren Buffett's great thing is buy companies with great moats around them, i.e. companies that are protected from competition, effectively. And that's the kind of company you're going to get if you're investing in a more Keynesian kind of economy where the government, or what we now think of a Keynesian kind of country. So if you're investing in an economy, say, well, there's quite a lot of government intervention, very high level of regulation, etc., you may be able to find companies that have these kind of moats that'll keep them going indefinitely.
I like the idea of investing in moated companies. It always plays into my suspicions that the entire world is still run by the Knights Templar. Warren Buffett wants moats around his investments. But then again, do you trust a man who is basically named after finger food laid on for rabbits? I went on to ask Merryn what investors think about investing in countries with Marxist tendencies, partly because I'm becoming increasingly worried about my exposure to the Venezuelan high-end leisure sector.
If you see the arrival of a very left-leaning or Marxist government, you don't want to be invested there because the risks are simply too high, because it would necessarily lead to a difficult environment for corporates, and it may also well lead to high levels of inflation, and these are bad things for markets.
Marxism is a philosophy that, to the degree that it is coherent at all, is dedicated to thwarting the urge to make a profit from the sweat of someone else's brow. It seems only fair that it should not offer exciting investment opportunities. Yet, before we completely laugh off the idea of making profit as a Marxist investor, Merryn told me something about Marx I didn't know.
So, you know, Simon, actually, Marx did invest, or more speculate, I should say. There is some evidence that he speculated little in the US, but mainly in the UK stock market, and even made some money, apparently around 400 quid or so the equivalent of 10, 15 grand today.
That's not bad, is it?
Not bad at all, but there is some suggestion that, you know, his wife would have liked him to do it a little bit more. I think he only did it, you know, for a small amount of time, made this amount of money, and there's not much evidence that he continued to be a kind of day trader in the UK.
So Marx had a portfolio, or more likely I imagine something like a carrier bag with some coupons stuffed in it. But hopefully he earned enough to get his coat out of the pawn shop, at least so he could go down to the library again. Yeah, righto, Karl. I couldn't let Merryn go without checking whether or not my friend's recent idea of investing in asteroid fragments is a good move or not. Art has long been a clever play on the vanity of the super wealthy, but in a globally unpredictable world with the money draining away from the traditional players, it turns out that scientific artifacts such as the shattered debris of asteroid impacts are apparently becoming an investment opportunity. And as artifacts, they are genuinely universal and long-lived too, in a way that Banksy say might not be. Is this sort of thing a clever investment in a globalised world?
People will always want asteroids. This is the thinking. What do you think? Does that sound like a good... do you think should people invest in asteroids?
Well, if you believe over the long term, as I do, and I think you do as well, that global wealth will continue to increase, investing in anything that is rare, limited in supply, and people are going to want over the long term is a good idea. The only thing I would say is that there is no guarantee that the supply of asteroids will remain limited.
No, I suppose if a sufficiently large supply of asteroids hits the Earth, at some point the whole question becomes moot anyway.
Well, that's also true.
So, there I ended my conversation with Merrin on the cheerful subject of asteroid-based Armageddon. And perhaps that's an appropriate note on which to end the series. Unsurprisingly, I haven't managed to solve the global economic crisis in 30 minutes. I think I actually got distracted before we even started. But hopefully we've started a conversation, even if it's only about what passes for comedy on Radio 4 these days. In this series, I have enjoyed spending time with Smith, Marx and Keynes over the last 4 episodes and wildly picking and choosing bits of their theories to poke fun at and broad brush apply to the world's current economic woes. So what have we learned from our 3 economic big beasts? Well, from Smith, I think I may well be advised to remember that people are really inclined to be good, given the opportunity. Don't assume that everyone else is a rat and a snake. We want to be good, and we want to be seen to be good by others. So perhaps the best way forward from here would be with a bit more Smithian loveliness. From Marx, we learned that when in doubt, pawn your coat. And also, if something really annoys you, then just identify the seeds of its own destruction, sit back and wait for 50 years. Keynes taught us that good old-fashioned retail therapy really does work. You can spend your way out of any crisis. And also that being absurdly well-connected, urbane, intelligent and attractive company certainly has its advantages. Smith, Marx and Keynes all had ideas about how to solve our economic problems. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. The more I read into it, the more it strikes me as similar to child rearing. Everyone has their own theories about how to raise children. The Duke of Rochester famously said, "When I was a young man, I had half a dozen theories about raising children. Now I have half a dozen children and no theories." Very much the same applies to economics. Whatever you were doing when it all started to go right again, you generally think is a good theory until you try it again and it doesn't work. Hey-ho, you'll never know. And as Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. Thank goodness for that. Thank you for listening and goodbye. You've been listening to Simon Evans Goes to Market with me, Simon Evans, and Tim Harford. It was written by me, Simon Evans, with additional material by Tim Harford, Dan Evans and... Hello and welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market. Or rather, welcome back. It's been a couple of years since we were last on air, and we did think that in our previous 5 series we had covered pretty much everything that needed to be said about the economic platform, if you like, on which your augmented reality of a daily life runs. But, of course, very much like Public Health England, we failed to reckon on the possibility of a new transmissible disease having a greater impact on our fortunes than even a 15th unit of alcohol might do. So, here we are in a new slimmed-down, contagion-friendly format. No Tim Harford, we gave him his break and it's time for him to fly free now. No Merrin Somerset Webb, I'm afraid, and no drinks trolley either. Though on reflection, I'm not sure the drinks trolley was ever actually acknowledged in the credits or indeed mentioned by name in the budget. So perhaps we just skip over that for now and crack on with the show. This week, we address a harsh economic truth that has been with us since biblical times and only thrown into sharper relief by the pandemic. The tendency of wealth to concentrate itself in fewer and fewer hands in an ever tinier minority of nauseating billionaires. A thing about which it has to be said, Jesus himself seemed remarkably sanguine. For whosoever hath, to him shall be given, observed the Lord in the Gospel of St. Matthew, and he shall have more abundance. But, he went on, whosoever hath not, from him shall be taken away even that he hath.
This, it must be emphasised, was an observation of Jesus of a universal law, not an actually suggested remedy for fiscal irregularities in Roman Judea. Though it has to be said, it might be easy to shrug at such things when your own baby shower was blessed with precious metals and some nice upmarket smellies from the Orient, rather than the usual gendered fluff and gummable knickknacks. But even by the standards of the neoliberal consensus, or acquiescence at any rate, in the last 18 months, this division of fortune has been more pronounced than ever. Among all the other fault lines the pandemic created and exposed, none has been more stark than that between the economic winners and losers. Not even the one between those who still clap our NHS and those who saw just one too many TikToks of dancing nurses. And no, this would never have happened if they'd brought back Matron. There have been a number of wealth migrations this century, from the young to the old, from the west to the east, and from my own savings to what is still laughably referred to as the joint account. But the last year has seen the fastest and most irresistible transfer of wealth of all, from the 99.99% into the hands of the most concentrated clique, cartel and cabal of billionaires the world has ever seen. Who are these new elite, and what is it like to be them? Are they friendly, hostile, or, like the coming AI singularity, simply indifferent to wider society, its values and goals? Later, I'll be talking to Robert Watts, the compiler of the Sunday Times Rich List, to get his insights from a career spent monitoring these rare creatures like an Attenborough of Dosh. But first, a few terms. The technical term for these people now seems to be ultra-high net worth individuals, or unwins, as I've just decided to make that. That is how they are known to the professional toadies who set up agencies to anticipate their every need, from meeting the band backstage to keeping the girl's name out of the papers. But ultra just reminds me of the latest iteration in the marketing of toothpaste. More appealing than the nearly white range, sure, but still basic. Some call them the uber rich, but that sounds like they've amassed a fortune by saving on conventional taxes. And anyway, that, as I have since discovered, is a false economy, especially once your kids learn how to hack your account. So we will refer to them as the super rich, a good old-fashioned name with a nice Alan Wicker touch to it. And he was perhaps, after all, their most successful professional voyeur, the man whose loafer steps I shall now follow, albeit wearing a gossamer thin negligee of economic objectivity over my alternately gawping and scowling features. We want to look not at the comfortably off, but at people who are so wealthy that it bends space-time like a black hole, which is, of course, often what they have, where their soul is meant to be. Or is that envy speaking? Almost certainly yes. After this last year, who could blame me? Not only were these bastards living in houses with grounds so extensive it would be possible for them to ride their horses, Hummers and Harleys all day long and never even find out whether they were in lockdown or not, but also, while everyone else was running around in safe mode, going long on toilet paper and bargaining for the right to walk the dog out of sight of their own front door, they actually accrued vast new tranches of wealth, clocking up zeros faster than I did during my brief foray into ratemyface.com. In fact, in the top 10 of who had a good pandemic, coronavirus itself only makes it to number 4. Number 3 was conspiracy theories. Number 2 was actual conspiracies. But the world's 3,000-odd billionaires, and some of them are very odd indeed, came out on top. According to the Harford Global Rich List of 2021, the world added 412 billionaires last year, bringing the total to a record 3,288, despite They say despite the disruption caused by COVID-19. I would say not despite it, but under cover of it, the bastards, which is what really smarts. The billionaires' combined wealth rose 32% year over year to nearly 15 trillion US dollars, a sum that falls unimaginably between the GDP of the world's two biggest economies, the US with just short of 20 trillion and China with 12 trillion. If these 3,000 individuals were to set up their own country, it would immediately be the second wealthiest in the world. A stock market boom, it went on, driven partly by quantitative easing and a flurry of new listings, have minted 8 new dollar billionaires a week for the past year. Quantitative easing, as I'm sure anyone who's stayed with this show for any length of time knows by now, basically means money printer goes brrrr. In other words, governments have knowingly and willingly created these billionaires out of thin air rather than see their national stock markets present a true and honest picture of the health of their economy. 3 individuals added more than $50 billion in a single year. Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and someone called Colin Zheng of China's e-commerce giant Pinduoduo. Colin has an admirably generous first name, and I salute you, but I will leave you alone for reasons of security and concentrate on the 2 Yanks. I will say, however, China jumped way ahead of the US total this year with 1,058 billionaires, up 259 from a year ago. Now, that's what I call communism with Chinese characteristics. The US added a mere 70 to take their total to 696. Third place is a set of steak knives. Third place is you're fired. Now, the super rich flourishing in a time of pestilence is nothing new. The very first example of the capitalist Übermensch was a textile merchant by the name of Jacob Fugger. That's F-U-G-G-E-R, who thrived while Europe was in the grip of the actual plague at the turn of the 15th century, amassing a vast fortune at a time when much of Europe was never sure if it was going to come home to a happy family or a house full of bubonic carcasses. Fugger the Rich, as he was known, I swear I'm not making this up, though. No doubt there were a few phonetic variations on that too, but Fugger the Rich was born into an already wealthy mining and weaving dynasty in 1459. He cunningly wove banking into the warp and weft of the family trade and became the only reliable lender of truly vast sums to crowned and mitred heads across Europe. By his death in 1525, Fugger had amassed a fortune roughly equivalent to $400 billion in today's money, far more than any of today's upstarts, and indeed far more than the monarchs, princes and popes, to whom one can imagine him inclining his head with only the most cursory of deferential nods. Back to our recent woes and the 21st century fuggers that have emerged from Silicon Valley to capitalise on contagion. In 2020, while most of us were desperately trying to make sense of the new world order, grudgingly suckling on the teat of state and spending our furlough on something called Deliveroo, a strange moped-mounted form of marsupial with the pouch on the back, so still harbouring something about as appetising as a 3-week-old kangaroo fetus. While this was our lives, they were cleaning up. And as the immediate threat of the virus begins to recede like Mongol hordes withdrawing from the smouldering ruins of our prosperity, this, to quote the great Khan, is the new normal. Ah, well, at least I finally got round to reading Crime and Punishment. It's amazing what the impetus of having to finish a page before you can wipe your arse with it can do to your reading speed. I recommend the Penguin Classics edition. The Oxford is much less forgiving. Anyway, the richest fugger on the planet now is Jeff Bezos, or GB, as I've just decided to call him. Who be the world's wealthiest man? He be GB. GB is, of course... That's taken him down a peg or two. GB is, of course, the founder of Amazon, which began as a bookseller but now sells everything, including the kitchen sink, or to give it its correct name, the Amazon basin. GB is actually only half a fugger, a semi-fugger if you will, worth about 200 billion. But still, were he to liquidise his funds into $100 bills and then employ a JCB to shore them up around him, he would stand as dwarfed amidst his wealth as the 20 millilitre bottle of eye drops I received yesterday was in the mountain of brown paper packaging Amazon delivered it in. Amazon's success under lockdown is easy to understand. Less plausible, perhaps, has been the quadrupling of the share price of Tesla motor vehicles in the last year. Admittedly, not being allowed to leave the house does make concerns over the car's range less of an issue. Even a Tesla can get from Durham to Barnard Castle and back on a single charge. Some people can do it without any charge at all, but still, it did seem a pretty extraordinary leap in speculative value. So, Elon Musk, or Elmu, as I shall call him... Tickle me, Elmu. Elmu is now number 2. And indeed full of it. He is, if anything, even more significant as the de facto figurehead of cryptocurrency, able to manipulate the value of various coins just by musing aloud on their fate like some kind of blockchain Stalin. At least until the cryptic Mr. Satoshi makes his identity known. Satoshi, creator of the Bitcoin, which also had a good pandemic, is, if he is still alive, worth about 60 billion this year. You do have to wonder what exactly he's waiting for. Perhaps the vertigo to pass? I know when I fantasize about having got in on Bitcoin back when it was fractions of a cent and now being a billionaire, my favourite part is the moment before I actually cash it in and I'm still mingling with ordinary people like my own family, as if I was no better than them. Bill Gates, meanwhile, continued to be very, very rich in the most incredibly boring way imaginable and has yet to exhaust his stockpile of man at CNA knitwear. Despite the sheer dysfunctionality of Microsoft Teams, he is still interviewed on tech and pandemic issues ahead of, say, my neighbour's son Henry, who built his own working drum machine. It really does suggest some sort of Faustian pact, which is possibly why his wife, too, has finally had enough. Hello, it looks like you're drafting divorce papers. Would you like some help? So, worldwide, the billionaires are doing all right. But how about in the UK? Are we all in it together? Thankfully, someone else has done the hard yards, collecting the hard data, and what's more, after a year of speaking exclusively to billionaires and studying their ways, he was almost pathetically grateful to have a chat with someone who was on his side of the fence, and if anything, even less solvent than he is.
I'm Robert Watts, compiler of the Sunday Times Rich List.
I began by asking him, Robert, we keep hearing Silicon Valley has had a good pandemic, but what about our own homegrown super rich?
We found 171 billionaires this year, up by 24 in a year. That's the biggest jump that we've ever seen. The wealth of those people grew by more than 20% during the year, £593 billion that they were sitting on. I mean, this was not the rich list that we thought that we would be coming out with at all.
So it seems our homegrown super rich have indeed had a good year. I asked Robert, you compile a detailed report, natures of investments, assets, income streams. I suppose the first question to ask is how sure are you that you've got your man?
I always call it a jigsaw puzzle, really, and part of it is trawling through papers, trawling through documents filed at company's house, shareholdings in public companies. Often, people ring up the phone and say, oh, you've missed this person, you've missed that person, why haven't you got them there? I just can't prove it with so many people. And with shareholdings in public companies changing every day, as soon as we put something out, you could say it's out of date. So it's incredibly frustrating, but it keeps me busy all year round.
Robert would himself make an excellent study subject now, I think. Imagine you spend all year, every year, analysing the wealth of the super rich in order to arrange them into some sort of league of absurd wealth in a year when your own industry is closing papers, slashing budgets and firing colleagues left, right and centre. It's a scenario, frankly, for making a murderer, or at least a hostile substack. Yet, to be fair, Robert does a good job of concealing the envy that must be gnawing away inside him by now like a brood of wasp larvae in a paralysed caterpillar. If anything, He seems rather to pity the poor cash-laden old buggers.
The biggest thing this has taught me the last 6 years I've been involved in this work is that money certainly does not make you happy. These people who look extremely stressed, who almost feel burdened by what they've created in a way. I don't envy them. Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, reckons that you don't want any more than $2 million US. After that, he says, the problems start.
Well, it is easy to underestimate the burden of privilege. The super-rich can actually be very charitable at scale, but they miss out on the warm glow of making eye contact as they buy a big issue that they don't really intend to read. I tend to drop mine off at the food bank. 2 good deeds for the price of 1. Still, perhaps it's just as well the super-rich aren't contributing to the street buffet. The last thing the poor need is to be worrying about serving up an undercooked spatchcocked guinea fowl when the meter runs out. So, what kind of people have done well under the pandemic?
So the online retailers, the likes of Boohoo, the likes of the Hut Group, the likes of Farfetch, ASOS, suddenly found all their competition shuttered. So a lot of people just headed online. And when you think about it, some of them many of their customers were better off in theory because they weren't commuting to work. They weren't spending money on going out. And so they headed online. So even Boohoo, which you'll remember the investigation last summer by the Sunday Times, which exposed appalling working practices and low pay at the suppliers of Boohoo in Leicester, that hammered the share price for a few months, but it quickly recovered. And as a result, when we came to do the valuation for the Kamani family, who co-founded Boohoo and still own a big slug of the business, they were on average across the year up £1 million a day since the previous rich list.
And I suppose what some of our listeners will want to know, poor deluded economically illiterate souls that they are, listening at home or in the car and still caught up in the tragic delusion that there is some kind of nobility in the idea that you work for a living, what, if anything, have any of them actually done for all this money? And are some of them somehow more deserving than others?
There's a really interesting question about the useful rich and the not so useful rich. The ones that, if they're manufacturing stuff and they're employing a big workforce of 100, 200,000 perhaps, you can see and if the conditions that those workers are working in are good, and then you can make the case for them, and perhaps you feel easy about them as a human being, that the owners are accumulating stupendous wealth. But if it's the opposite, how useful is it for us to have those people here in these countries? Are they paying a lot of tax? Well, actually, if their businesses aren't here, maybe they're not. Yes, there may be some fairly eye-watering council tax bills to pay on their large London mansions and their country estates. But actually, is there a bang for the buck for the British public of having them here?
Britain's richest homegrown man is James Dyson. Never mind Big Pharma or Big Oil, he created Big Suck. And what I initially took to be the messiest urinals in public laboratory history. He even invented a fan, a home fan, to dislodge all the dust you thought you'd cleaned up. It's perfect vertical integration. He now owns vast tracts of farmland in the UK, though rumours that these farms are dedicated to just providing more dirt are unproven. Meanwhile, the nation's wealthiest self-made businesswoman is Denise Coates. She is a betting billionaire, her main bet having been that some people can't resist pegging their welfare checks to random sporting events. Apparently, she owns the country's favourite gambling website, Bet365, although I'm not sure favourite is quite the right word for something so compulsive. It's a bit like saying, my favourite brown powder? I'd have to say heroin. Still, Bet365, it's nice to let us have a day off once every 4 years. I admit, wary. I am wary of going in too hard on the super-rich for fear of jeopardising that invitation that forever seems to be lost in the post, the one that 25 years as the country's only properly reactionary comedian really should have brought me by now. And personally, I have no problem with billionaires per se. Many of them made their money developing industrial processes that have improved the lives of millions, or at least an app that takes valuable seconds off parking your car. I side with Peter Mandelson and have no problem with people being filthy rich as long as they pay their taxes. I just feel with that amount of money, they should be a bit more flamboyant. Why do they still wear suits and ties? Why not figure-hugging silver catsuits or Mary Antoinette wigs or velvet capes and pointy hats? Where are the gold fingers and the doctor's no? The closest the British have come to a supervillain is probably Deborah Meaden. And come on, be honest. Be honest, which of us wouldn't get brusque after being pitched yet another poorly budgeted mobile dog grooming service? It's not her fault that Britain has so few dormant volcanoes that can accommodate the modern fitted lair. Anyway, time to address perhaps the central issue away from the envy. It is often claimed that the super-rich are able to dodge taxation. They are that way by being beyond the powers of the state. Of course, we could tax Amazon more, but the individuals are slippery. Is there a better way to spread the love around? Kidnapping and ransom demanding has been shown to have limited utility. It would have to be used sparingly, or the super-rich would simply remove their children and put them on private islands, or perhaps install disabling devices in them, like those Securicor cases that release a dye when they're snatched. But on the other hand, it might suit the social Darwinist outlook of the super-rich. Any child of mine not quick-witted enough to dodge abduction is only weakening the family gene pool. But what does Robert think?
I've never really been a big believer in the idea that as soon as you raise tax rates up a bit, these people fly off to Monaco or Singapore, Switzerland, wherever. It is tricky that if you think of taxing income, it's quite straightforward, isn't it? You know, you just raise a rate, and you won't perhaps raise as much as you think you are, but you should be able to bring in some cash doing that. But a lot of the wealth on the rich list is shareholdings in public companies or stakes in private companies, which are very hard to value, first of all. And then if you're going to get at that wealth, how do you actually get it into a bank account so you can tax it? So if someone owns a £100 million business, we are valuing it at £100 million. So if we're going to say apply a wealth tax of, say, 5%, then what are we saying? We're saying that that owner needs to give us £5 million off to the Treasury. Do they have that money sitting in their bank account? They may not. So are you saying, well, should that owner have to sell that business to realise that £5 million? Does that hit the share prices of those businesses if lots of rich people are being forced to sell their shares? And does that have an effect on the value of the company, which has an effect on UK pension funds, which affect you and me, Simon? So that, it's not quite as straightforward, but could you tax these people more in sort of simple terms in higher rates? Yes, I think you could.
I think the solution is probably a blend of inheritance tax and shame. I suggest, and this is a serious suggestion, I suggest 100% inheritance tax on death, but you can avoid this upper rate by paying earlier. Voluntary payments, the earlier you hand over the bulk of your assets to the state, the less of your fortune the state takes in total when you cop out. And you can insist that the state leaves it in the companies, the equities and interests you already have. No need to liquidate and frighten the horses. Nobody need know. The government now has a controlling interest in your company, but it's still you who attends the meetings. The state just signs off on your decisions, creams off the dividends and borrows against the equity. Essentially, the state here is like a mafioso to whom you've lost money in a poker game. Many would say that this is just reflecting reality as it already exists. Secondly, shame. We need to use psyops on these people, convince them that they have time to change. That hole in the middle of their hearts can be filled with love. I know this show has the ear of many of the world's wealthiest people, and I don't mean that in a weird kidnapping ransom sense. I mean they're listening to the programme. Believe me, it's not us we're thinking of, it's you. This wealth, this burden, it's weighing you down. Don't wait until Rosebud is in the furnace or Jacob Marley's chains hang around your necks. Lay down your weary tune. I think King Lear has a lot to answer for. I'd get it off the national curriculum. It needn't be that way. This is your legacy. You can enjoy it now. Don't wait. It'll make you feel good. Besides, what otherwise can you spend that kind of money on? Just how many levels of Prime, Premium and Premier are there? Are you really naively hoping to dine on honeydew and drink the milk of paradise, to transfer your consciousness into a succession of lithe-limbed 9-year-old Brazilian street orphans, to ensconce yourself in ever larger private, densely wooded grounds, where fewer and fewer drones purchased from your own website can hope to penetrate the secrets of the inner glade and spot you in a clearing, groaning in ecstasy as a specially defanged polar bear slurps at your seal fat smeared jockstrap. Give it away! If you don't want that to be your fate, give it away. So, what have we learned? Well, obviously, pandemics are good for billionaires. And if I'd learned anything much more useful than that, I'd have left ages ago. But Hitler and Napoleon were right about one thing. If you really want to rule the world, you need to get your hands on some Russian assets. And if you spend your life stewing about not getting in on Bitcoin at the bottom, you'll miss out on the next utterly absurd Ponzi scheme that will ultimately plunge you into bankruptcy and despair. Dogecoin to the moon. Fads come and fads go. But as always, hard work, tireless networking, and the never fully articulated suggestion of yacht-based violence will always carry you a long way. Next week, we'll be looking at the high street, one of the most high-profile victims of the tech super-rich. Thank you very much, and goodbye. You have been listening to Simon Evans Goes to Market. It was written and presented by me, Simon Evans, with additional material by no relation Dan Evans. The series was produced by Richard Morris. This is a BBC Studios production. Hello and welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market. This week, well, we got there in the end. It's a risky strategy to finally deliver the goods in Series 6 after the commissioners have been on a promise like some sort of Radio Scheherazade all these years. But like Ronnie Barker finally enjoying a bowl of breakfast oats at long last, we are finally going to market. The actual market and its modern bricks and mortar parallel the high street. Historically, it was the market, not as an abstract mechanism for establishing price, the invisible hand, much beloved by Adam Smith and Phil Collins, but as an itinerant, floating carnival of banter, as much as barter and exchange, a place for actually buying stuff that defined the town. A town had a market, a city had a cathedral, a village had a church, and a hamlet had a pig, presumably for rent. Some of these ideas now seem archaic. Cities are secular and defined by orders of magnitude rather than orders of service. Villages still have a church, but it's rarely full except for weddings, christenings, and hurricanes. And a significant minority of hamlets are now entirely vegan. But the town, just about, remains the place to shop. Or it did, until the half-bat, half-crow hybrid that is COVID-19 descended over us like a wet 70s Sunday of gloom. The Great British High Street, everyone agrees, is in trouble. Where once swam the leviathans of retail, the High Street is now in as perilous a state as the high seas, not so much overfished as utterly fisted by online alternatives. Denuded of vitality, diversity, and the surging oxygenated currents of yore, its mortal remains are now like those of a disintegrating whale carcass, a feast for scavenging payday loan companies, bookies, and talon extension parlours. Life is elsewhere. Online shopping has done for bricks and mortar what air travel did for cruise liners, streaming did for CDs, and the rampant rabbit did for my self-esteem. So at least it seems, from the endless stream of commentators sadly announcing its death and gambling for its clothes. In the no doubt Vaseline-smeared lens through which I view memories of my youth, high streets were cheerful, largely because they were bustling. Yes, there was a good chance you'd get beaten up by a gang of skinheads for provocations obscure. Probably in hindsight for saying things like provocations obscure. And yes, I knew private individuals who had a more comprehensive collection of decent albums than some of the record shops I visited optimistically every Saturday afternoon. And yes, there were longueurs, such that I was eventually lured into shoplifting from Woolies just for kicks, the flapping of which criminal butterfly wing might, for all I know, have led to their eventual closure 30 years later in 2009. But it was still where the action was, or what passed for action in 1980 St Albans. There was a buzz, and not just that of an unearthed earth appliance. It was where I got my first Saturday job, first on Harry's Fruit and Veg, polishing green mould off the oranges and fulfilling small ad hoc errands for my ruddy-faced and somewhat unlettered colleagues. I still burn with shame when I remember the sheer ineptitude of my contribution and my failure to ever come back with the long way, the skyhooks or the glass nails requested of me. This was the first of many establishments to somehow spontaneously come up with the nickname Little Lord Fauntleroy, I assume to describe my natural aristocratic bearing. From there, it was on to Dixon's, Freeman, Hardy and Willis, and Ryder's Sports Shop, none of which I was any better suited to, but which were at least warmer and didn't expect me to be there at 5 a.m. The checkout was also, more to the point, where we checked each other out. A job in Harlequin Records, later Al Price, was probably the coolest, most sought after, though I liked the girl I knew who worked at Baker's Oven and was always good for a free sausage roll. But Boots' makeup counter... Boots' makeup counter was like Singapore Airlines first-class lounge for a spotty 16-year-old with all the impossible allure of an early Roxy Music album cover. If word got around that a boy was going out with a girl from Boots, it inspired more awe and respect than being able to drive or punching a prefect. So much for nostalgia. Lately, the high street feels neither quaint and picturesque nor cheap and cheerful. We can argue back and forth whether our nation resembles Orwell's 1984 or Huxley's Brave New World, but there seems little doubt that our local town planning department was inspired by Eliot's The Wasteland. But is the high street dead, or is it merely resting? Can it be revived? And more to the point, should it be? We could pump public funds into it, of course, but is there a pulse? Or will whatever is coaxed back to life be a Frankenstein's monster, an abomination, a cruel mockery of the paragon of former days? Do we want to see the British High Street staggering around, its grotesquely oversized, bloated top-shop head stitched to a BHS torso with visible sutures, rigid HMV arms outstretched before it as it stumbles blindly into consumer needs and desires it is no longer capable of understanding, let alone satisfying? Do we want to revive the Virgin megastores, headache-inducing ambience, and vast collection of music you have no interest in whatsoever, while unaccountably missing the one bloody thing you did want? To revisit the desperation of trying to subtly discern which of the visible teenagers among the Miss Selfridge shirt racks is so obviously sociopathic, disaffected and disengaged that they might plausibly work there? Do we really mourn Woolworths and their offer of pick-and-mix sweets, last year's toys and something you could cut your own hair with and then, after a quick check in the mirror, move on to your wrists? A mix that for years seemed charming and quirky, then overnight suddenly seemed incoherent, mad and vaguely disturbing, and had crossed the line between eclectic and certifiable. To be fair, we do still have pound shops if you want to experience the sense of having had a stroke in retail format, but at least they are often next to each other so that you can compare prices. Do we wish... Do we wish, above all, to see a return to traipsing, that peculiar leaden version of perambulation which only the high street and certain stages of puberty inspire? It is tempting to think not, to feel like a paramedic looking down at a blacked-out junkie with a syringe, a bottle of vodka and 3 wraps of crystal meth by his side and thinking, yeah, we can save this guy, and then seeing he's still using an iPhone 6 and thinking, nah, this one's for the skip. And yet, there are good reasons, and not just economic reasons, not to merely let it fade away. At its best, the high street is still where the feel-good factor happens. In my adopted hometown of Brighton, and believe me, they'll let anyone adopt there, it's still where the non-sporting, non-religious part of the community congregates at the weekend. It's where you get a sense of who you share this mad ride with, and we need that, especially if we're going to talk ourselves out of this present black hole. The High Street has a long history in this country, long enough to have become part of the national myth. It was formally first established by charter. In that original Build Back Better scheme, Christopher Wren's plans for a phoenix to rise from the ashes and burnt pie crusts of the Great Fire of London. High streets were officially decreed and carefully delineated to limit commercial sprawl, but it was only in the 19th century that bricks and mortar really began to replace the bi-weekly market. And I must say, bi-weekly as a frequency, I should add, not a mildly asserted sexual preference. lack of preference, I suppose. Shops offered the reassurance. Shops offered the reassurance of a named establishment, reliability, a proprietor with something at stake, and a degree of deference which costermongers notoriously eschewed in favour of unearned familiarity. I am not treacle, sir, and nor is my wife, believe me. It would be easy to feel nostalgic for this era of cheerful trade, but according to BBC History Extra's website, bakers, for one, worked punishingly long days. 80 to 100 hours a week was not unusual 100 years ago. They consequently suffered poor health and often a limited lifespan, while their loaves might be adulterated with chemicals, chalk or potatoes to improve the whiteness and bulk out the volume. Which is rough, but in my view still more conscientious than trying to sell air pockets big enough to put your thumb through as some sort of token of artisan authenticity at the local farmer's market. And don't get me started... Don't get me started on my daughter's jeans. They're just a collection of interconnected seams. It's like a denim curly-whirly, but... I digress. Shopping, as a celebration of economic freedom, what we now call consumerism, was a post-war American proposition, of course. Britain, after the war, was still more about consumption with a capital TB. Gradually, our slightly seedy, short-winded version of the post-war boom shook off the moths and weevils of rationing and started to embrace the abundance mindset, after all. Julie Christie, Twiggy and Jean Shrimpton inspired 1,000 boots and boutiques, and London started swinging. Many of our least loved buildings began to sprout on and around the high street. The shopping centres, designed in the architectural style known as 60s dismal, these displayed a concrete brutality that seemed intently designed to sap the spirit and also to urge you to get inside them where you couldn't see them, of course. The 70s were a hard time for shops, with attempts to brand British goods with Union Jacks cruelly satirised by punks and Valéry Giscard d'Estaing alike. But as the 80s gathered pace, Margaret Thatcher threw the coal under the bus and some North Sea oil on the fire, and the resultant boom finally rekindled the notion of shopping as a recreation rather than a grim necessity. This was the era of the HMV Superstore, Ralph, 5 times a night Halpin's Topshop, and Burton, and shiny electronic gadgets like the Sony Walkman, Nintendo, and compact discs. Items that I think of as technology, and my son regards as one might an artefact of the Phoenician Bronze Age. These were the golden years, and even though out-of-town retail developments began to hold the high street's arms behind its back in the 90s, it wasn't until the web really began to pummel the poor bugger's unprotected torso that she began to weaken. How I hold my head in my hands, like Alec Guinness in Bridge Over the River Kwai, as I remember the enthusiasm with which I punted those ZX Spectra in Dixon's on a Saturday afternoon. Little did I imagine I nursed a viper at my breast. And so it is that all these singular, unique irritations are being replaced by homogeneous, frictionless clicking. In truth, of course, the friction is being merely outsourced to the double-parked delivery van and the gritting of your teeth as you find a little red card of woe on your doormat. We lurked briefly outside your front door, but you failed to identify our slump-shouldered silhouette through the frosted glass as we fainted at the bell, so, yah boo, sucks to be you. Even if you do snag one, of course, traditional courtesies between customer and shopkeeper have been replaced with a gestured demand that you sign a small handheld device with a stub of plastic 2 inches long that makes an Argos pen feel like a Mont Blanc. And more often than not, your own thumb. So it goes. Is this all true, though? The pandemic has been cruel, but the strange death of the high street has been announced and anticipated more often than that of the NHS and James Bond, and yet somehow it's always righted itself time and again and limped on. I spoke to Diane Whirl, Insights Director at Springboard, a company that specialises in analysing the economic health of the high street to see if it's now truly moribund and beyond saving.
Well, it's quite interesting. I think we've got a before COVID and after COVID scenario happening. So over the past decade, what we've seen is a slow reduction in footfalls at about 2% a year. And that's because people are spending their money online. So we've changed the nature of our trips to high streets. We go less often. We probably don't go for as much functional shopping as we once did. We buy some of that online. So that was happening anyway. And over the COVID period, we've seen some interesting shifts. So before COVID, we saw that the smaller high streets were really struggling. They'd lost more footfall than the bigger places. People were gravitating to big cities and using those because they were more an event, and you could get lots more shopping there and lots of eating out and entertainment. During COVID, as people worked at home and stayed local, it was our smaller high streets that were much more resilient than our bigger cities. Everyone deserted our big cities. So yes, smaller high streets have had a challenging time across the board, but through COVID, they probably fared better than our bigger cities.
See, I'm not surprised about this. I don't think the traditional lure of loads of shops, let alone over familiar shops, is what people want now. That's playing the internet on their own turf. What high streets can offer is tactility, texture, aroma, the great smells, bread, coffee, salt and grease, and for me, key grinding dust, but I might be peculiar about that. So... reminds me of the time spent inside. So I put to Diane... maybe it's old-fashioned high street smells that the high street needs.
Well, of course, continental food markets have been doing that for the past 20 years. You know, I mean, I remember going to one near where I live, and I've spent a huge amount of money on a big block of Parmesan cheese. You know, I could have bought double the amount of Parmesan cheese in the supermarket, but it was so appealing. Those things have been happening, and those are real attractors in our town centres. People love the smells and they love markets, and that is all happening, actually. If you go around the UK and you have a look at the activity of those who manage our town centres, business improvement districts and town centre managers, they're very, very active in making sure that they're delivering these event type of traders into our towns. You know, Christmas markets are very common, you know, before COVID, and people love them. You know, they love the smell and the taste and the sights of Christmas, and that is happening around our town centres. And I think, I mean, I'm not a great believer in replicating the past because it comes pastiche, but what you have to do is have a current version of what was good about the past. And I think the current version of what was good about the past is the fact we can deliver really fantastic food and people want to see it and smell it.
So it seems to me that the best way to approach the high street is to remember that it is quasi-organic, not in the sense that it is expensive and doesn't taste any better than a regular street, but that it's a complex emergent system. Like any emergent system, my son's haircut, for instance, it can always benefit from a really vicious pruning. You don't want to shave it to the bone. But it might be best to cut off the dead wood and dispiriting droopy bits and restore a sense of vitality. Let's not be meek. Let's turf out the non-viable, the charity shops, the obvious fences and cash converters. Limit the number of shops that can operate and instead investigate the potential of mixed use. The obvious first thought is, should we promote residential use? Get people living over, next to, or even if it's a slumberland or a hills, in the shop.
I think the issue about living in high streets, residential in high streets, has been a topic that's been talked about and has been promoted for a long time. And you know, it's been met with mixed results. Some towns have done it really well, and some people have been enormously happy living above shops and stores and in the high street. And in other places, less so. And I think people do forget that when you live in a town centre, it can be quite noisy. And so people have this, you know, this romantic notion of living above retail. And then when they do live above retail, they find their sleep is interrupted because people are out in the streets at 11 o'clock at night. But having said that, it brings life into town centres post-closure. And that's what's really important. And I think a lot of towns are now thinking about, you know, student accommodation. And that is a really good way for towns to have life and vibrancy, because young people love it. They'll be the ones being out anyway. They'll be less impacted. And we need student accommodation. So a lot of towns are looking at that as an alternative now, in addition to private residential accommodation.
I can see the appeal of young people all being secured in one place, but I have another suggestion. What about pre-retirement villages? Not for those who need sheltered accommodation, more still at the tutting age. People who are old enough to judge, but young enough to interfere, to keep an eye on skateboarders and littering and hanging about. but who crucially have the option of switching off their hearing aids so they won't be able to hear the drunks and buskers late at night. The premises are ideal for the near elderly. They'd be handy for the post office, and those in their tricky 60s can easily find company on the street benches, curing what is regarded as the greatest threat to the elderly: isolation, loneliness, not being sworn at enough. They could even supplement their pension by keeping an eye on small children and dogs while parents and owners nip into the shops and indeed the pub. Always leave a phone number in case you forget to pick them up afterwards. Another part of the mixed-use model is, of course, office space, especially hot desking, a term which is somehow tempting in a way that warm seating isn't, despite amounting to the same thing. This is an ideal solution for people who don't want the expense and responsibility of running their own office, but also don't want to get anything done. It makes money for the owners in much the same way that gyms do, i.e. people join with the best of intentions and then stop going. It's like fractional reserve banking, but for chairs. So, I asked Diane what the government could do to help the beleaguered high street.
I mean, I think it's a blend. The government has stepped in, and there are a number of funds helping retailers to start up, and the government have started the High Street Task Force, which is to support towns to help them regenerate. And there are a number of barriers to regeneration. Business rates is a huge barrier, we know. You know, it's
There's a number of literal barriers in Brighton. They put them up at the end of the road.
Yeah. And business rates is an archaic tax. It's a property tax. It's not a trading tax. So, of course, it doesn't reflect the current trading environment. So these things are barriers. But ultimately, change will happen. You know, in every trough, there will be a peak and there will be an opportunity. And to some degree, the market will balance. You know, rents will shift downward. They inevitably have to. And that will make it more affordable for some retailers to come in.
So, all that could work, and for some towns is probably ideal. But it is to me specifically the 90s high street that is now slumped in the doorway of one of its own abandoned shops, like an Escher drawing of retail failure. There is a reason for this. The 90s high street is unloved, and rightfully so. Cynical, mass-produced, soulless, homogenous. 90s high streets were the CDs of shopping. Once the future of music, these were rendered swiftly obsolete by a new online technology and found they were not mourned. No one had any sentimental attachment to the medium. No one loves CDs. Once you started seeing the free ones from the front cover of PC World being used by your dad as coasters or cat scarers, they lost the last of their appeal. Vinyl, though, that's another story. My daughter, 17 years old, has a perfectly good streaming unit in her bedroom, but still, she would rather spend all her pocket money on vinyl. She loves the tactility, the artwork, the connection with the iconic albums from the golden age of the music she loves. And so far as I can tell, she isn't skinning up on them yet, but it's only a matter of time. And when it comes, I hope she will go down that route rather than the vape, a technology which makes CDs look like a Steinway baby grand. So, let's rediscover the vinyl essence of the traditional high street. I want to stimulate the imagination of British people beyond homes and offices and tell them a more exciting story than that, about who they once were and could be again. I would like the high street to be a place where we can properly whore out our glorious past, because this, of course, will also inspire tourism, and that's where the big bucks of the future lie, I think. After all, like the stately home, the dry stone wall, and inadequate parking, Britain's high streets are one of the defining glories of our landscape. The French have markets, of course, where they saucily squeeze aubergine and buy baguettes that are stale before they're back on their elegantly filigreed veranda. They have a single local shop from which they can buy both their tobacco and, madness, their stamps. And also their nasty little coffees. They have a boulangerie where they can play boule, presumably, and three or four pharmacies or 4 pharmacies per head of population with a lit green cross in the window that sell cosmetics discreetly packaged to look medical and necessary. But if they want football boots or kitchenware, let alone the latest fashions from London, oh yes, the French have to drive into Paris and visit a Printemps or a Galerie Lafayette. There is no middle ground. In Germany, of course, goods are delivered automatically several hours before the customer is aware that they needed them due to efficiency. All these nations will find our traditional high streets attractive, and a well-curated high street could be a great attraction to the East Asian market, which we still seem oddly slow to target as ruthlessly as we might. It's a great way for us to claw back some of our deficit from their manufacturing hegemony. But perhaps we should ask what, if anything, the high street really is, or rather, what is it that we miss? It isn't shopping. If anything, many of us really like shopping online. We find it dangerously close to addictive in a way that shopping on the high street never really was. What we want, I think, is just to feel that it's busy. We want to feel part of a thriving community. The high street is really about intersection. The sense that goods make the journey now rather than merchants doesn't negate the thrill that comes from standing at the crossroads of the world. Hong Kong, New York, Constantinople, London, Vienna, Samarkand and Tyre. All the great cities of the world have had this element, and this is what you want the high street to have too. I grew up in St Albans, named for England's first Christian martyr and blessed with a mellow old abbey and more pubs that claim to be the oldest in the country than in any other city, although that claim is in itself disputed by Canterbury, York and plucky little Harlow. But my greatest source of pride was the old Peahen Crossroads, which until they built the new London bypass was the busiest road junction in the world. Admittedly, that was in 1796, but the legend lives on. If the high street is to survive then, it might not be as a magnet, but rather as a U-bend through which as many people as possible have to pass and, yes, get a bit blocked or at least slowed down a bit as they pass through. Traffic has become a bad word, but as long as it's moving, at least a little bit, inching along, traffic is what makes things hum. Traffic is the blood flow, and in this country at least, most attempts to eliminate traffic end up turning asphalt jungles into stagnant ponds, de facto skate parks, arenas for outdoor lager enthusiasts, and the off-brand pharmacological trade. In other words, if you want to save the high street, it might be time to close the bypass. So, what have we learned? Every era is someone's golden age, and the high street is where memories are made. Whether it was buying your first 45 at Woolies, visiting your old bank, the first to convert to a Yates's wine pit, or just the milkshaking of a local hate figure that had made the local TV news. It's vital to keep it alive as a stadium for the next generation's dreams. Given time, the invisible hand will no doubt enable the high street to adapt, but some voices will always be louder than others, and in this case, money talks. If you want your high street to reflect your needs, desires and questionable aesthetics, then you need to get out there, and like a recidivist Saudi shoplifter, vote with your feet. Spend, spend, spend. As ever, my dear old Brighton shows us that when it comes to retail, people will travel for the 3 Qs. Quirky, quaint, and quite busy on a Saturday, but in a fun way. This is not mere nostalgia. The high street matters. It was its Roman counterpart, the agora, the market square, the centre for commerce, in which all the vital activities of the day were conducted, in which vox populi was heard. It was from this word, agora, not as many assume the agri and agriculture, or indeed the agro, as in don't want no, that we get agrophobia. The fear not so much of wide open spaces, but of barter, banter and trade, of seething, surging humanity. Now, I am, of course, respectful of the BBC's intent not to trivialise or debase legitimate medical conditions by using terms such as OCD to mean tidy, bipolar to mean moody, or dipsomaniac to mean pisshead. But is it possible? Is it possible on this reading we have all become a little agoraphobic of late? Understandable if so, but I'd like to encourage as many of us as have had our jabs, or indeed chosen not to, back into the high street, into the agora. Without us, there is a serious danger that this great British institution could be the latest thing to die within 28 days of testing positive, and we'll have no one to blame but ourselves. Well, maybe China, but mainly ourselves. Thank you very much, and goodbye. listening to Simon Evans Goes to Market. It was written and presented by me, Simon Evans, with additional material by no relation Dan Evans. The series was produced by Richard Morris. This is a BBC Studios production. Hello and welcome to this special series of Simon Evans Goes to Market, in which we investigate some of the aftermath left behind by 18 months of pandemic and post-Brexit turmoil. Today we look at the performing arts, one of the least important sectors in the British economy, though you'd never guess it from the racket they make. This, of course, was the unspoken wisdom behind Rome's bread and circuses. Not just keep the populace fed and distracted, but keep the clowns on side too. This lot know how to project when they protest. It's not just theatre, of course. Rock concerts, ballet, opera and performative male feminism have all taken a hit this year. Even Prime Minister's Questions saw ratings fall, with the new cast failing to reinvigorate what many regard as a tired format for exploring political differences, certainly when compared to the likes of Hamilton, or digging up 12-year-old tweets, or open-air rioting and statue toppling. In fact, you could argue traditional circus skills such as mask and mime have come out of it best. Mime had a very good year, not just because suddenly everyone empathised with the frantic figure battling with an unseen enemy, trapped in a box made of consensual convention and social control, but because the art was actually practised by millions of frantic individuals trying to communicate through layers of synthetic mouth lint and jerry-built plexiglass barriers, which half-litre of vodka and unbranded packet of fags they wanted from behind the armoured shield. But many other vernacular genres of live entertainment have also suffered, with badger baiting, unlicensed bare-knuckle Morris dancing and dogging, all falling collateral of the police drones deployed to deter ramblers from endangering their health with excess of oxygen and vitamin D. The British have retreated to our screens, whether laptop, tablet, TV or phone, and increasingly all four at once, as the national attention span continues to contract to dimensions previously only imagined in string theory. How long before a new video sharing platform called simply Tick promises to put less of a strain on our mental capacity than Chinese state-sponsored data suck TikTok? I like to think that being physically present in an audience still has some therapeutic, spiritual and, yes, economic benefits for the individual and the nation. Benefits that cannot be entirely replicated online. But is this something that can be quantified, tabulated and analysed in the way that excess fatality, vaccine uptake and voting intention can? Or is it something that can instead be ignored in favour of the science? There are good reasons to regard theatre survival into the 21st century as little short of a miracle already. This is a medium that predates not just Netflix, YouTube, film and TV, but electric light, running water and God, or at least the Christian church. But now it has another challenge, a challenge to overcome the particular hybrid of claustrophobia and agoraphobia that the virus has left on our psyche like a scum rim on the bathtub of existence. The fear of being stuck in confined spaces with a large crowd. The sensation that previously only a really harrowing production of Samuel Beckett's Endgame could deliver is now available purely from the act of taking a seat in the middle of a row and waiting for the first cough to start. What can it do? What can it do to survive? Economically speaking, there is precious little fat to trim. The average salary for actors in the United Kingdom is just £25,000 per year, or £12.88 per hour. Even the most experienced rarely more than double that, and one of those facts of life that most parents still struggle to persuade their celebrity-obsessed children of, especially when confronted with the recent mutant variants such as influencer, vlogger and OnlyFans e-girl. From an actor's point of view, this last 18 months may have seen an improvement in earnings. Just as productivity has been shown to surge in offices when the internet goes down, the closure of theatres nationwide may well have seen significant improvement in the earnings of many of its practitioners, as they're forced into more lucrative occupations and accept work other than that which they can drop at a moment's notice when they get a call for an audition. And it might be thought, if not said out loud, that in an industry where only 10% of those who describe themselves as actors are able to actually provide proof of that and pursue that profession at any given time, is it really such a tragedy if that figure falls briefly to zero? But while the theatre may not be an economic powerhouse, it has subtler effects on the health of the nation. The central London West End venues attract huge international stars and excitable international audiences that lend London a lot of its buzz. Ambassadors for the theatre talk about soft power, a claim which usually carries about as much weight with economists as it does in my bedroom. But actually... Yes, thank you. Actually, in this case, there is some truth to it. There is glamour in the theatre. Glamour, of course, originally referred to a spell, a charm, cast by fairies to make one of their crones appear to a mortal man as a blushing, peachy young maiden and trick him into falling in love with her. So you will understand when I say that theatre has a certain glamour all of its own. But seriously, no one crosses the Atlantic to visit our great British call centres, after all. And theatre attracts the better kind of tourist too. The solvent kind, rather than those who come here for the festival season and end up sleeping on my beach. American cinema stars like to bring their star quality to the Gielgud and the Astoria and barter it for theatrical credibility. And that is at least as encouraging a sign for the special relationship as Joe Biden remembering Boris Johnson's name after a full 3-minute time lapse. And there is no doubt that the bright lights and marquee names do make Theatreland sparkle in the rain. But around the country, from repertory theatres to provincial art centres, a different picture emerges, a phrase that will either summon up dark rooms or dial up, depending on just how past it you are. Many venues were already relying on tired TV tie-ins, the calculating enforced jollity of the panto season, and package tours of bands from the 80s playing their 5 hits. None of this is really, I fear, much missed. The best estimate seems to be that box office takings nationwide before the lurgy struck were about 1.25 billion per annum, with an average of about £27 a ticket. Not a huge slice of our £2 trillion GDP, less than a thousandth in fact, though add an extra tenner each for the interval drinks, gently warming on a shelf, perhaps the most perfectly designed contagion vector since spit before you shake and put it there custom was cannily introduced. By an American flu remedy salesman in the 1920s. Another tenner for parking, £5 for a programme. Do you need a programme? I think I know what's on. It's going to be that play, isn't it? The one we came out to see. And of course, 30 quid to the babysitter and half a bottle of watered-down scotch. Yes, Debbie, 2 can play at that game. And that probably represents about 5 billion of activity in the economy generally. It's still pretty small beer. Indeed, you might be forgiven for wondering how it attracts quite so much anguished debate about its future, not least on this very channel, Radio 4 being one of the few remaining places where an arts degree is thought to represent more than a passage of time and an assumption of debt. But actors punch well above their weight in terms of TV media coverage for obvious reasons. Special pleading is slightly less annoying in a well-modulated tone, and they are often easier on the eye than the average representative of the retail or financial services sector. It's no coincidence that some of us end up plying our trade on the radio, and not just because I can more easily pass for Sandy Toksvig when working in this medium. My best shot at playing the Dane remains the radio adaptation of her life story. I have a few observations and suggestions for the live entertainment sector, but it is important to recognise that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. For some, government subsidy might be the answer, while others might still have a trace of dignity and pride about them, and the capacity to produce content adequate to attract paying customers. I think theatre can pull out of this, but there is no doubt that even by Harold Pinter standards, this has been an uncomfortably long pause, and The Caretaker, Dumb Waiter and Birthday Party are now not so much productions to star in as tempting alternative offers of employment. The key is to understand the psychology of the audience. The fact is, even as government decree loosens its grip on our freedoms, like beaten dogs, many of us have lost our natural esprit, élan, and joie de vivre, all those things for which the French have always envied the Brits. The first thing to do then... The first thing to do is address safety concerns. Anyone who had the experience I had in the front row of a school trip to see Julius Caesar at Stratford 40 years ago will understand one reason why some are nervous about re-entering the fray. Ben Kingsley gave a magnetic performance as Brutus, but I was more struck, quite literally struck, by the huge, clearly visible arc of saliva which erupted like tracer bullets across the footlights from the mouths of loyalists and conspirators alike. However, on this front, there are workarounds. The stage famously has a fourth wall, but as long as it remains a conceptual device rather than an actual barrier thick enough to stop the front row getting a soggy lap and a shirt like the back of a scholarship boy's blazer, audiences will be nervous. Theatres traditionally lower the fire curtain between acts, but while it might be worth considering keeping it down throughout, this would likely diminish the magic of the thing. Perhaps instead, James Dyson could be persuaded to repurpose his hand dryers to create a significant enough updraft such that any spray that accompanies a rousing speech would at least be directed up into the gods, where people who've managed to get in for the price of a prawn sandwich can take their chances. A 1980s production... A 1980s production of the Oresteia by Aeschylus that I saw on YouTube recently got me thinking. The cast wore full-faced tragedian masks, obscuring their features entirely. With actors gesturing and turning their heads to indicate who was speaking, the actual dialogue was pre-recorded and heard over the theatre's speaker system. This suggested a possible solution. Stay home and watch old plays on YouTube. But it is worth remembering... It is worth remembering that as well as being topical, masks were the original form of theatre and can still be hugely powerful. And for all we know, citizens of ancient Athens may well have introduced them after being simply fed up of being spat on during a typhoid outbreak. It would also eliminate the anxiety of the understudy having to perform if the famous lead goes down with the virus. With her voice recorded and her face covered, no one need know who is on stage, much as no one in Florence can still remember which one is the real David. In the event that social distancing is necessary again, spacing out audiences lowers box office takings, of course. But this can be compensated for by cycling through several sittings in the course of an evening. Get a play down to about half an hour maximum, and I don't think anyone would complain, to be honest. 90% of the fun of the theatre is in the opening scene, that Christmas morning sense of magic and anticipation as the curtain goes up, and the ingenuity of the stage set of the imaginary new world is revealed for the first time. Once this wears off, 2 or 3 minutes in, one often slips into ennui, if not outright fatigue, bladder anxiety and thirst. Let's instead have a series of highlights, tableau vivant even, with a précis in voiceover replacing the action, a few famous speeches, the one big scene, there's always one, and then the finale, and bang, you're back in the bar with a chance of being able to really enjoy your gin and tonic without the prospect of the second half hovering over you like the shade of Banquo at the feast. Certain conventions will have to be addressed. Coughing will have to be taken much more seriously. Shouting fire in a crowded theatre used to be regarded as the limits of free speech, an epitome of irresponsibility, while coughing, on the other hand, or more usually coughing straight onto the hair of the lady in front, was regarded as de rigueur in British theatres, the equivalent of a bravo or encore. It was as endemic to a matinee as gentle snoring, a mobile going off, or the occasional feedback whistle of a hearing aid being cranked up to 11. But it should now be regarded as being provocative as waving 5 fingers of Semtex with an alarm clock stuck to it. And I know BBC rules on product placement mean I shouldn't mention brand names, but just that one shout-out has got me enough to blow up a family car. OK, so the parking spaces aren't exactly allocated, but we all know whose is whose. In the event that a COVID vector is identified in the theatre, we will need a new protocol to prevent panic. Again, in the event of a fire, theatres, like all public buildings, generally have a coded message to prevent a stampede. The most common one in theatres involves a call for a Mr. Sands to make his way to the lobby. This is well enough known in the acting community to allow anyone who's ever worked in the theatre to clock what's going on and get a head start on the rest of the punters, which seems fair to me after a lifetime of waiting table and pretending not to notice where Sir Hugh keeps putting his hand. I remember my old school adopted the protocol, Ian Furno is in the stationery cupboard, which at least meant the literate and observant were saved first. But there are other more radical solutions to such fears, of course. I am very proud to be a patron of the Brighton Open Air Theatre, and I can see no reason why its form could not be rolled out to parks and playing fields across the country. Open air theatre is great, partly because there is strong evidence that outdoor transmission of COVID-19 is virtually zero, and also because there is always the hope that the production itself might be rained off. You need the right actors, though. You need the right actors. The great outdoors is no place for the Martin Freeman style of naturalistic muttering. You need full-strength Brian Blessed delivery, audible across any nearby softball game, car alarm, or indeed the A40 flyover. The other advantage of open-air theatre is that you can bring a picnic and a cushion and look forward to having a bit of knee room. Many of the most venerable theatres in this country were built in the Victorian era, when installing seats to accommodate anyone significantly taller than the Queen was seen as disrespectful, if not downright treasonous. This was fine, as the populace at that time were so chronically malnourished that their bottoms were never more than 9 inches wide anyway, and their knees rarely extended more than a foot from their hips. The rickets did lead to some unwelcome knee friction, but that aside, these stunted but cheerful folk used to be able to sit comfortably in the auditoria for hours at a time. Nowadays, theatres sit on the deep vein thrombosis scale, somewhere between a long-haul flight and your first AstraZeneca. Thankfully, I should say other risks of blood clotting are available. All these obstacles will have to be overcome, but many would argue it is worth doing so, despite the ready availability of home entertainment. And despite my gently mocking, cynical tone, I agree. Philosophers, from Aristotle to Nietzsche, have credited the theatre with uniquely restorative functions, the catharsis to cure societal ills. Harold Bloom wrote a book called Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, asserting that Hamlet's soliloquies were the artistry that first made us aware of our own internal monologue, very often even as it is muttering to itself, "Why am I sitting here? Why am I watching this? I could be having a pint." It's not for everyone. I have 2 kids, one of whom regards the theatre as very much her tribe, and one who finds it literally excruciating. And I get that. One of the great things about screen content, especially when you're a 13-year-old boy, is it is rarely as cringe as theatre can be. You don't feel embarrassed for people. Not as easily anyway. It can happen, such as watching former Home Secretary Alan Johnson being revealed as the Masked Singer, and no one, including I suspect Alan himself, being quite sure who he was. But it rarely induces actual spasms of empathic shame. There are more radical solutions to the cringe issue. Holograms are getting better all the time. Ghostly evocations of Richard Burton, Marilyn Monroe and Tupac Shakur now take the stage, often among regular actors, where they enchant and impress, don't forget their lines or bump into the furniture, and they don't spit. Could the entire cast be one day replaced by this kind of technology? More exciting still, will you soon have one of your own? You can send one to watch the play for you. Well, so much for my paltry insights and suggestions. But what does the profession itself think? One of the surprise hits of lockdown was a TV comedy drama which explored the response of actors David Tennant and Michael Sheen to their altered circumstances. Staged was a Zoom-based show devised by someone called Simon Evans, which resulted in the biggest flurry of congratulatory tweets I've had since 2004, when I won 3 consecutive stages in the Australian Rally Championship. I thought it might be about time we had a chat. And I started by asking him if the success of Staged hadn't inadvertently proved that theatres aren't necessary and people will never come back. Seriously, is he optimistic about theatre's return?
Yeah, I am optimistic. I think it's going to take time, and I think there's a slight risk that what will need to happen in the short term is very sort of risk-averse work. Theatres and theatre owners have lost a lot of money this period of time, so they're going to want to put on shows which are guaranteed crowd pleasers. They're going to want to put on plays that they can mount at minimal upfront cost. So the first things that are going to come back are going to be those shows that were already existent. You know, Les Mis is going to be back before sort of anything else is. And it's also going to make audiences, I think, as long as the safety of being in the theatre is still in any way opaque, they're only going to come out if it's something that's really unmissable, which I think is going to mean we're going to want star casting again, and they're going to want to be guaranteed a good night out. So I feel like short term, everything's going to be quite safe.
Well, if they're going to be risk-averse, that's finally put pay to my all-trapeze Indonesian version of Twelfth Night that I was hoping to get funding for. So next I asked him for his rallying cry. Why should people come back to live theatre?
Just come back to theatres because, as you say, a laugh is great, a gasp is great. The first time I go to a theatre and cry with other people in there, and I think that's going to happen. I think everyone's already quite spiky and sort of soft in a way they haven't been in years. I'm like, go to the theatre and just blub at the end of a big show and just do that together, because it'll be so because we don't sort of have those rituals anymore, do we? That idea of let's all go to a place and go through something together and then leave having sat in a room with complete strangers and cried and laughed at the same time. Nothing else really comes close. So just go, and there shouldn't be any snobbery about what that is. Just go and see whatever musical, whatever comedy, whatever anything you want, but just sit in a room with other people and go through the same thing with them. It'll be good for you.
I do hope that theatre finds a way to come roaring back into people's lives. It is needed more than ever. It's absolutely true what Simon says. Being in an audience, sharing emotions, profound emotions, joy and sorrow alike, is a powerful thing, not least to reassure us that we've not gone insane. This, I honestly think, is one of the many unacknowledged services performed by live theatre. Its direct contribution to the economy may be meagre, but the wider economic costs of mental illness in England, including direct costs of services, lost productivity at work and reduced quality of life, have been estimated at over £100 billion each year. And that's in a year when we hadn't all been locked up indoors and kept on a steady diet of conspiracy theories, Matt Hancock and fear. If theatre can save even a few more billion being added to that dismal total, it would be money well spent. Of course, visiting the theatre can induce the other great drain on the economy, a bad back, but you just have to take your chances sometimes. I have been a stand-up comedian for 25 years now, and I thought I might end this week with an unapologetically biased assessment of comedy's role in the life of the nation. Now, economically, stand-up comedy makes theatre look like General Motors in the 1950s, and becoming an actor like going into medicine or the law. A handful of comedians have become very rich indeed. Jack Whitehall was the top earner in 2020, grossing over $4 million in ticket sales even before the shutters came down. But those stories obscure a very, very long left tail. Few people get into stand-up with any reasonable expectation of getting rich or even giving up the day job. It's better understood as an addiction, a compulsion, more akin to skydiving or perhaps teenage shoplifting. Not a job or even a vocation, but a pathology. And even now, after 25 years in the trade, I took a job in Peterborough 7 weeks ago on a margin so tight after petrol and overnight costs, it was eliminated entirely when I got home and realised I'd left my nice new toothbrush in the hotel bathroom. But stand-up comedians have never demanded subsidy, and I doubt ever will, partly because they recognise that just to be listened to for half an hour is a privilege in itself. That familiar lament, "Is it just me? Have you ever noticed?" conceals an anxiety as human as any I know, and feeling it melt away in a gale of laughter, of recognition, is a much better solution than you'll find in any pill. I first met my future wife in 1999 at the Brixton Comedy Club. I say future wife, I should clarify, she is now my present wife, not some sort of future wife that I'm still keeping optionless open on and pursuing as an alternative at some point. It would be unwise to mention that on air. The headliner that night was Mike Wilmot, a gravelly-voiced, grouchy Canadian comedian. Mike might just be the most natural comedian I've ever worked with. Watch him on stage and it's hard to avoid the sense he was born standing up, if slightly hunched. I'd had a drink with Kate and a mutual friend in the interval, but it was watching Wilmot together that first kindled the spark between us. Mike's best stuff is unrepeatable on radio. That is, frankly, kind of the point of live comedy. But suffice to say, when you share a laugh that hard at filth that funny, you definitely bypass many of the awkward getting to know you stages of a relationship. The one thing that all comedians learned in the last year, apart from how to code, how to make a piece of cheese last, and that their wife no longer works at Woolworth and has left them, is how big a part of what they do is provided by the audience. Comedians learn how to make an audience laugh. Remove that element, and very few of us were any better at being funny than your mate was with his WhatsApp meme about a dog in a car wash. So I hope we can revive our confidence in the power of the audience to nourish the parts of us that vaccines can't reach. Maybe theatre and stand-up will emerge stronger than ever. The Black Death famously wiped out a third of European peasantry, but initiated a significant improvement in the economic conditions of the two-thirds it spared. Science advances one funeral at a time, but society, it seems, requires mass graves to really make progress. One of the many factoids to go viral in the first wave of COVID-19 was the notion that Shakespeare used his time under national quarantine to write King Lear. Whether true or not, it's certainly the case that the Globe Theatre was closed from time to time as death swept the nation yet again. But at some point the Globe reopened and King Lear was performed in front of the actual king, James I, while the groundlings no doubt jeered and chewed and spat their way through the tragedy a few short yards from the optimistically slippered royal feet. "We read," said C.S. Lewis, "to know that we are not alone, and often it works. But to eliminate the very last traces of doubt, you really do need to go and see a show." So, what have we learned? The theatre may be economically small, but we really need it so that other sectors can prosper. As sometimes it takes pointing out a threadbare gas bag in laddered tights strutting about a quarter-full auditorium to scare your offspring into A-level choices that lead to a proper job. The theatre will survive, the actors will return, thank God. As I've pretty much had it with my Deliveroo driver asking, "Are you welling up because of the extra onions or because of my tragic yet compelling portrayal of 0 hours contract worker?" Live entertainment may be in trouble, but it's a little too soon to stuff the cast of Cats in a sack and head down to the local canal. Actors, hang in there, as surely soon you'll feel that thrill again of showing us all your twankies. Thank you very much and goodbye. You have been listening to Simon Evans Goes to Market. It was written and presented by me, Simon Evans, with additional material by no relation Dan Evans. The series was produced by Richard Morris. This was a BBC Studios production. Hello and welcome to Simon Evans Goes to Market, the final episode of this series. In the first 3 episodes of this post-pandemic appraisal, and yes, I am saying post, it's over now, that's enough, we looked at 3 areas of concern: the devastation wrought on our high streets, the upwards transfer of wealth into the hands of the super-rich, and the challenges facing the performing arts as they try to ease open their doors. But this week, I want to switch to positive mode, to embrace the opportunities that the post-COVID post-Brexit boom might present. It seems to me that the present government might have an unusual and unanticipated chance to map out a vision for where Britain goes next. Winston Churchill wrote that there is nothing more exhilarating in life than to be shot at without result. Our Prime Minister, inching ever closer to a passable peacetime pantomime of his hero, can now legitimately claim to have experienced something akin to dodging a bullet too. Boris Johnson did very nearly die last year, of course, unless you believe the ventilator truthers. But the bullet I'm referring to is an allegorical one, whereby any possible economic damage done by Brexit has been obliterated by the asteroid crater left by COVID-19. Instead, 2021 provided an almost immediate and incontrovertible benefit of our new freebooting identity in the shape of millions of squat little glass ampules trundling off on thousands of tiny milk floats, not to Berlin, Paris or Brussels, but to the good old NHS. Our ability to secure advantageous vaccine delivery schedules was not an issue, I think it's fair to say, foremost in the mind of Leave voters in 2016. But it all counts, and as it all fell into place, Bojo must have felt that he had not only dodged a shower of bullets, but had been granted Neo in the Matrix-like abilities to watch them pass harmlessly by his head, like a shoal of airborne mackerel. Indeed, looking at his ratings rise inexorably despite everything from his Mrs. Taste in wallpaper to one of the highest death tolls per capita of any Western nation, or indeed Eastern nation, or undiscovered fictional, hypothetical or mythical nation on Earth, he must wonder if he is living in a simulation created solely for his pleasure. Is he slumped on his back on a sofa amidst a heap of crisp packets and biscuit crumbs, having actually lost the leadership election in 2019, and wearing a high-end VR headset, now enjoying an alternative reality in which the rest of us are all non-player characters, not just the obvious ones like Keir Starmer and Beth Rigby from Sky, but all of us. How long before he stops attempting to deflect Starmer's forensic critiques of his latest outrage with stammering, kerfuffling verbosity, and instead simply stretches out his hand into a podgy claw and effortlessly channels the force to elevate his hapless adversarial irritant several feet into the air before gesturing him back onto the vacant bench behind him, or possibly Angela Rayner's lap? Boris Johnson has operated in this mode for as long as anyone can remember, using Steve Jobs' notorious reality distortion field, only with more Latin. His wayward journey down the bowling alley of his career has repeatedly bounced out of the gutters of ignominy and disgrace and back onto the camber of public approval, though whether by the invisible sausage cushions of destiny or the infuriating idiocy of the electorate is a matter of dispute. Johnson is Teflon, Kevlar and Scotchgard, not just rolled into one, but shaped and stitched into a soft toy, clearly on the verge of a product recall. But as long as it holds, and currently it looks like the only realistic prospect of him being brought down would be an army of resentful offspring appearing like fire ants overwhelming a backpacker with a twisted ankle, it does represent a unique opportunity for radical action. So, what should he do with this momentum? Like every other leader in the free world, build back better, he says. A recovery with feminine characteristics, he suggested recently. What is that exactly? A recovery that gently murmurs, don't worry about it, it's fine, it happens to everyone, as the country looks mournfully down at its lingering recession. Is that the blue pill? Is that the blue pill we're being offered here? But what are we to build back better? Little Britain, Airstrip 1, a pirate ship moored off the coast of Normandy, a string of shining new Shanghais, magnets for bankers, would-be Pacific rimmers and other rent-seeking parasites? Or something a little quirkier and more truly British? My sense is that we need to foster a culture of innovation, but with British characteristics. Remember, they may have invented Facebook, Google and TikTok, but we invented programming, artificial intelligence and the World Wide Web itself. We did this by tinkering. We are a nation of tinkerers, hobbyists, gifted amateurs. The Ada Lovelaces, Alan Turings and Tim Berners-Lee of this world all had something of the lovable eccentric to them, as did the Magnus Pikes, Heinz Wolfs and Johnny Balls, who communicated the love of science to our kids. We need to bring back the shed. We need to bring back long, rainy afternoons without any online distraction. In a word, we need to bring back boredom. If there is one thing... If there is one thing I associate with my childhood, it is the yawning chasm of the Sunday afternoon, the utter desert of time stretching before me, devoid of stimulation. Songs of praise used to come on the TV at 6 o'clock in the evening and lighten the mood. But as a consequence, I amuse myself with tinkering, Meccano, Lego, something to do with straws, and in the process developing many of the ideas that eventually made possible the viability of today's offshore wind farms. Sadly, I never shared those ideas and have now to accept that my role is likely to be ignored by history. But never mind, it was fun. We need to bring back wet 1970s weekends, salad cream sandwiches in front of Going for a Song, accompanied by your sleeping nan's whistling nostrils, was enough to get anyone heading for the spare room workbench. The fact is, of course, many people today have barely outdoor space at all, let alone sheds. We need to repurpose unused offices, retail and industrial space, and pubs left destitute by latte-sipping metropolitans, all broken up into small units, free of business rates, for innovators. Access would be via a Dragon's Den-style presentation to a board of proven tinkerers. Perhaps name it in honour of the Duke of Edinburgh. And once a year, a lookalike goes round and ejects the ones he thought were nonsense. Get out! The world doesn't need any more artisan dog treats. Where's that chap with the home still? Get him in here now. Tinkerers need a network too, of course, between stretches of deep thought and pipe smoke and a space to share their ideas, because their parents don't care and their friends think they're weird. The app names itself. Tinker will be the brainstorming equivalent of Tinder. It lets you know when there are people nearby who you can run ideas past, or who want to pitch something to you. And through use, each user will gradually acquire a detailed rating. Inspirational, thorough, obsessive, bullshitter, fantasist, actual motive is sexual, etc., etc.
Well, so much for my views on tinkering, but what might a real inventor think? I decided to speak to Professor Lucy Rogers, who describes herself on her website as an inventor with a sense of fun. That sounds like tinkering. Lucy, can I ask you, is a sense of fun an important element in the process of invention?
Well, it is for me. I really enjoy just playing around and tinkering. And if someone's got a fun problem, I'm really curious of how I can solve it. And the great thing with fun and maybe flippant projects is the underlying science or engineering is actually applicable. So grab someone's attention with the fun and flippant and take that bit of engineering or science and apply it in the real world to an actually important problem.
Interesting. This is encouraging. So in the shed scenario that I've been discussing, either literally a garden shed in your own garden or possibly sort of workspaces being created out of post-industrial units, that sort of thing, what kind of setup would you recommend to people if they want to sort of start tinkering and possibly creating something? Is it worth having a soldering iron? Do you need to have electronics? Do you need to have one of those tanks with the big rubber gloves in so that you can mess around? You know? What kind of level of equipment do we need?
Well, it all depends on what you're trying to do. I mean, you can start with just coding, and so all you need is a computer. Then moving on to electronics, and so a cheap soldering iron, and you can now get USB powered soldering iron, so you could actually plug it into a USB plug and start soldering. And that's a wonderful skill to acquire somewhere along the line. And just even things like assembling the furniture, you get flat pack furniture and just assembling that and seeing how it goes together, and can you use the hammer. And so you don't need the more expensive things, the 3D printers, the laser cutters, although they are fun.
I think if you could invent a better system for putting together flat pack furniture, the world would definitely beat a path to your door. So do you think in the modern era, realistically, do any meaningful inventions emerge from the amateur end of the spectrum, from the tinkering end, or is it all coming out of either Silicon Valley or massive sort of university departments?
No, they definitely come through the tinkering bit. We don't hear of the inventors when they are part of a company often, but there are an awful lot of ways that you can get your product to the market now through Kickstarter or whatever. So it's really good. And there's a scheme in Germany called Jugendforscht, which is actually youth researchers. And from that, they do it when they're about 14, 15, and their education system's slightly different. So they've got a little bit more time at that age to do science projects. And they've had patents come out of that from these 14, 15-year-olds. So there's definitely scope there.
It's interesting. I mean, I've been wondering what we could do in the UK to encourage the next generation of inventors and to make it seem like it's a fun, possibly glamorous thing, possibly kid them that there's a lot of money involved. Is there some sort of way of urging them forward with the adoption of a good song, perhaps a friendly, furry mascot of some kind?
Oh, if it was only a song and a mascot, that would be absolutely wonderful. I think there's a lot of cultural shift needs to change where, we see inventors as boffins with fuzzy hair and glasses and lab coats and generally old men in their sheds tinkering, and that's not really a good image. It's not what children aspire to be. But when we can actually see we are solving problems, we are solving people's problems, that really helps.
This vision of distributed suburban creativity might disappoint those who want to see the UK mimic the corporate models of Silicon Valley or the Asian tigers. But I was never convinced by the Singapore-on-Thames thing. It sounded to me much more like a middle-aged man's fantasies of a Thai bride rather than a viable economic model. And I say, be careful what you wish for. While San Francisco is fast becoming the very definition of a modern dystopia, with the middle class all but gone and wealthy tech elites stepping gingerly over comatose fentanyl addicts and fly-bone bubonic corpses on the way to work, the city-states of the Pacific Rim have struck another Faustian pact for economic success and basically gelded themselves for gold. Singapore has a fertility rate of just 1.2 children per woman. Hong Kong's is 1.07, and in Seoul, the paradigm of unfettered growth, it is 0.64. This is a level of reproduction historically only seen during not just war, but a long drawn-out siege when the diet of tin food and eventually pets has an understandable effect on the libido. It is below the level that would be considered acceptable in a prison, convent, or even some Catholic high schools. And these nations have all fallen from producing 5 children per family just 70 years ago. I suspect that the urge to recreate yourself in miniature cannot entirely be replaced by fur babies and photo face apps. I am sure this childlessness is a source of some frustration and sadness. And I suspect it might just provide the UK with the market opportunity of a lifetime. No, not providing the fertility, tempting though it is to send a team of professional British studs out there like a 21st century Flashman novel. But the service we offer is rather to mitigate the cost and inconvenience of having kids by taking them off their hands, not for hours, but for months and years at a time. This was the function served by British prep schools in the 19th century when we were the top dogs. And it was no coincidence that when half the map was pink, the first thing any ambitious Brit did upon promotion was outsource his young. Today, this is the service we can provide to the IQ shredders of the East and hopefully keep their exceptional genes in play for posterity. Unless this sounds like I'm prescribing a somewhat subservient role for Britain in the great game, let me assure you, as Hitler, Antonio Gramsci and the Jesuits all knew, those who own the youth gain the future. Offer sanctuary to the offspring of the world's single-use burnouts, and the bond thus forged with Britain would be forged in fire. And crucially, as they eventually return home, it would allow us to disperse malevolent sleeper agents ready to be activated with a single phone call. I call it the Mancunian candidate. By the time they have completed their studies, they will have dated and probably been seduced by attractive young Brits, possibly government mandated. We'll see if it needs that. From my observations, I suspect not. They will have been suckered by maternal British matrons and landladies who will have filled the mother-shaped holes in their lives and converted them to that compelling ratio of sugar to grease in the British diet that they will struggle to find elsewhere. And they will have been inducted. They will have been inducted in the profound pleasures of being an elite in an old hierarchical tradition like ours, with proper pubs, cricket and robotic district nurses cycling past the village green. They will be ours for life, reinforcing British cultural supremacy worldwide, just as the pre-woke shortwave BBC used to. What would be helpful, though, would be an ambassador for the profession and for the British offer generally. Ideally, an eccentric, a headline grabber in the Elon Musk mould. Someone willing to go on the world service and not only refer to Taiwan as a country, but to accuse Xi Jinping of deliberately looking like Winnie the Pooh in order to lure small children into his room. A few such initiatives and we could really put Britain back on the map, albeit a giant one covered in pulsating lights in the Beijing war room. As an export, education is carbon neutral, as the buyers have to do all the shipping from their end. And when it comes to transporting children, the wasteful use of excess packaging is very much frowned upon. Education has always been the thing that separated the great nations from the also-rans. True, as with Germany in the 19th century, too long a period of unchallenged academic superiority can lead to military overreach. But I feel confident that our fundamentally hesitant nature, in combination with the seemingly terminal weakness of our armed forces, will safeguard against such a thing. Now, some might regard this as cynical profiteering, but the truth is that private education, like the newly inflated university sector, has always been a racket. Always. Geneticist Robert Plomin has demonstrated through his analysis of twin studies that once you control for other confounding factors, private schools bestow much less of a benefit on the spawn of the wealthy than you might think. Less than good looks do, certainly, or being born in October, say. Less than not smelling of damp, certainly. And funnily enough, less than a childhood spent coping with some degree of adversity. But that's not the point. You actually send your kids to public school to encounter adversity. Boys at Eton develop the sort of emotional robustness and bruise resistance you can only really acquire when you're forced to wear top hat and tails on trips into Slough. Our most lavish gifts to the world all emerged from the crucible of our public schools. Soccer, rugby, cricket, buggery, hockey, all these were codified at school and shared through empire. Some would say that we are no longer a world-beating side in any of these sports, but that is to miss the point. The point is not to win the game, it is to create diversions to keep the lower orders fit and occupied, to keep morale up. That is our talent, the instinct of the officer class. And when it comes to universities, Oxford and Cambridge are always in the top 10 worldwide, often the top 5. It may not quite match their consistency in the boat race, but it's still quite something. All the rest, incidentally, are in the USA, which means we can grow this sector without attracting yet more Yanks to the United Kingdom. Meanwhile, only one of the top 30, Tokyo University, is in Asia. This is our market. The key, in my view, is to think big. Cambridge University and the Life Sciences Centre is already world-class, but with the vast emptiness of East Anglia on its doorstep, the capacity to expand can be mind-blowing. And the closer it gets to Norwich, the more the value of my parents' bungalow goes up. Silicon Fen, a tiny slice of real estate which incredibly attracts about a quarter of all UK venture capital, is just the start. This could be the new fertile crescent of tech, the birth of a new civilization. The area is already defined, just as Mesopotamia was by the Tigris and Euphrates, by their tarmac counterparts, the A1 and the A11, or as the digital boffins know them, the A1 and the A3. Investment need not come from the public purse. As we discussed earlier in this series, we are all aware of the vast transfer of wealth to the new billionaires of late, whose gains map suspiciously well onto the overall losses incurred by wider society during the pandemic. Let's encourage them to endow some seats of learning to ease the tension. The prestige of the Hoover Institute at Stanford University in America could surely be used to tempt James Dyson to endow a rival in the UK. Now, it was in fact named for President Herbert Hoover, but that needn't obscure the bigger picture. And it might cost less than you think. Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, probably the world's most famous ongoing cathedral project, has only cost £1.2 billion so far. You could build a brand new university for that near Milton Keynes and call it Oxbridge to attract poorly researched custom. The same way that the Japanese created a city called Yusa in the 1960s to trick the Yanks into buying superior foreign goods, thinking they were homegrown. The key, I think, is to offer our billionaires a way to give back without looking like they're capitulating, but rather continuing to build. And this brings me on to my next big idea, my other strategy to actually build back better, which is very much in harmony with the first. Tourism. It is time to give the world the version of Britain it really wants. By far the most successful country in the world at attracting tourists is, incredibly, France. France regularly earns as much as $150 billion a year from recreational visits, twice what we do, and this, despite the fact that Paris is so disappointing, it actually triggers a recognised mental disorder, Paris syndrome. I promise you, Google it. Essentially, a massive sense of letdown as the lies cultivated by the tourist board, fashion shoots, and Hollywood of elegant models, cafe culture, and jazz-playing cats proves illusory. Britain is far closer to its Hollywood image of Hugh Grant, dreaming spires, Dalmatians and the wrong trousers than Paris is. Paris has nothing to offer beyond what we do, give or take slightly lower rainfall, and a paralysing surplus of pointlessly, minutely differentiated cheeses. Britain has billions in untapped tourist potential, especially now we are no longer bound by the rules of the EU Common Historical Policy, which so outrageously favoured the French and led them to think they could just serve shoe leather and frites for lunch every other day for 50 years and no one would dare complain for fear of being shrugged senseless. Let's create a heritage countryside once again, full of gingham-clad milkmaids, burly ploughmen and rare breed pigs. Not too full, obviously, or they just become pigs. Irregular fields with trees growing in them, bustling hedgerows and haystack hookups. And would it really be that much effort to dye grey squirrels red? Or maybe just feed them something red, like flamingos? Let's create town centres to match. Let's really market our unexampled historical offer. They needn't all be Victorian cobbled streets or toy shops with leaded glass and little black wheeled ovens selling baked potatoes and hot chestnuts. Some towns hit their zenith in the 1970s and could provide a really bracing, immersive experience to visitors if they recapture that ambience. Leave your devices at home and plunge back into the Birmingham bull ring of 1977. Your kids can experience the joy of sulking without so much as an Etch-a-Sketch to occupy their thoughts. While you, their headscarfed mum, can perch on a stool, flicking through fabric swatches and brushing your player's number 6 ash off a pattern book. This would be a history lesson in itself. Other towns should play to their historical strengths. Instead of feeling mutely ashamed of its inglorious past, Bristol could attract coach parties of angry activists looking forward to a weekend tipping evidence of it into the docks. The statues themselves can easily be reproduced on a 3D printer, spattered with some authentic gull shit in time for the next batch the following weekend. They could even be made of compressed fish food to attract a healthy stock of salmon back into the estuarial waters of the Bristol Channel. My hometown, Brighton, has worked out that the key is to attract particular interest groups on particular weekends. Rallies are very popular, vintage cars, military ambulances, Harley bikers. Can't be long before a Sinclair C5 rally starts snaking its way down the A23. Though perhaps just the once. The one thing we no longer see in Brighton is the Bank Holiday Mods versus Rockers punch-up, having lost the franchise to Tottenham, I believe. But the new gender-based tribal wars are starting to warm up nicely, with running battles of trans versus TERFs looking promising. And of course, there is something emboldening about being able to shout, "There they are, let's get them," even when you're only talking about a single individual. That, then, is my suggestion. That, then, is my suggestion for the future of Britain. Bring back the past. So finally, I'd like to take this opportunity to honour my father. Not a parson, but now 91, he has been a keen tinkerer all his life, and also a keen aviation enthusiast. We watched a lot of movies about aeroplanes when I was growing up, and if I wanted to paint a picture of the England I'd like to return to, it would be Leslie Howard as R.J. Mitchell in The First of the Few, reclining on the South Downs in a stripy blazer, observing seagulls wheeling and arcing through the skies, and being inspired not to heave a rock at them, as I am when I observe one of the buggers taking a dump on my car, but instead to design the Spitfire and thus ultimately guarantee our liberty from the soon-to-be impertinent Hun. The hugely important aeronautical innovations that have been made in this country over the years have rarely been capitalised on, often for political or macroeconomic reasons, and their potential has instead been exploited elsewhere. The rare occasion on which our focus and commitment to seeing a project through has survived budgetary assaults has been in the build-up to and execution of war. And not just any old war, but war with Germany. Now, such a thing was unthinkable during our membership of the EU, and consequently our avionics sector languished, a mere fifth in the world. But now that we have just the tantalising prospect that such a thing could happen, and that we should at least be armed in readiness, I really believe we would once again rekindle the technological elan for which our boffins were once the envy of the world, and the pride of men like my dad. And would Germany be game? I'm sure we hardly even need to ask. Like him or know him, Boris Johnson has proved, as did Donald Trump, Leicester City, Susan Boyle and Bitcoin, that no one really has a clue what might happen next. No one. But if a comedy character lampooning the English aristocracy, created by a man born in America to a 23-year-old student of Cornish Turkish extraction and a 22-year-old left-wing artist descended from Lithuanian Jews, can become our Prime Minister, then really, what mightn't Britain become if only it wills it so? So, what have we learned? The secret to our future prosperity may lie in the humble shed, which means the only thing that can hold Britain back is arachnophobia. If Edwin Starr had managed to fit in a couple of years at the LSE, he may have penned the rather more economically literate song, War! Huh! What is it good for? The sudden boost of economic output to a remarkable degree, granted that may well not be worth the suffering, but it's time for a little more depth in popular music. If you want to throw some leaves over the economic fallout from leaving a trading bloc, tuck into a bat or two. Not as unappetising as you think. Those wings are just perfect for dips. Thank you very much, and goodbye. You have been listening to Simon Evans Goes to Market. It was written and presented by me, Simon Evans, with additional material by no relation Dan Evans. The series was produced by Richard Morris. This was a BBC Studios production.